2, test 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, January 18th, 2023. Testing closed captioning.
I would like to call this meeting of the Tacoma Park City Council to order. Would the clerk please call the roll, please?
Mayor Searcy.
Here.
Councilmember Fulcher.
Present.
Councilmember DeBala.
Present.
Councilmember Gibson. Here. Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Honzak.
Present.
Councilmember Small. We'll be back in a minute.
I think he'll be back in a minute. Well, thank you all so much. I hope everyone had a wonderful Martin Luther King weekend and had an opportunity to do a lot of service. I'm first going to walk through just a couple of quick changes, trying to check to see whether or not there are any changes to the agenda. Otherwise, it doesn't look like there are. Otherwise, I'll just quickly walk through some of our upcoming meetings. So on Wednesday, January the 18th, the council will be meeting, I'm sorry, that is today. That means it's been a really long weekend. Monday, January the 23rd, at 6:30, the council will be having a closed session where we will receive legal advice as it pertains to Tacoma Junction and also matters related to collective bargaining negotiations. On Wednesday, January the 25th, the City Council will have its regular meeting, during which we will have proclamations recognizing Tacoma Park businesses that are closing, receive a legislative update, as well as a presentation on the minor master plan, strategic plan updates, sustainability and climate action framework, as well as the status of the public space management plan development. We'll also have a work session as an overview of boards and committees, including recruitment, appointments, and council process and application review. On Monday, January the 30th at 6:30, the council will have a retreat to discuss its priorities. And on Wednesday, February the 1st, our normal meeting at 7:30, the council will be meeting to discuss, we will have a Black History Month proclamation, a legislative update, as well as a work session as it pertains to the FY23 budget amendment, number 5. And on Wednesday, February the 8th, the council will be meeting at 7:30. Again, we will receive a legislative update, a presentation on stormwater, a stormwater update, as well as a voting session as it relates to our first reading, approving the FY23 budget amendment, number 5. All right. And so do we have any matters for the record today? Okay.
Yes, Mayor. Actually, I do have a matter for the record.
Sure.
I just wanted to state for the record a formal apology to both the mayor and to Councilmember Gibson for any sort of perceived discourtesy about the efficacy of either Robert's rules or the procedures of this council. I apologize to both of you, and it should be noted on the record.
Thank you, Councilmember Small. Okay, and today we will receive an update. Is Ann available for a legislative update? Wonderful. So today we were joined by our lobbyist in Annapolis, Ann Seacott, who will be providing us with a legislative update. Just so that everyone understands, for the next few council meetings, we will be receiving legislative updates as a regular part of our Wednesday meetings as we are watching and participating and hopefully testifying on bills that may come forward in this session. So with that, I'll turn things over to Ann.
Thank you very much, Mayor. It was an exciting day here in Annapolis with all the festivities of the inauguration of Wes Moore and Aruna Miller, now governor and lieutenant governor. So there was just a lot of music and some celebrities in town. It was quite an exciting day. So tomorrow is when we are told the new administration gets to work. So we know that there have been most of the major state agencies have had appointments made for secretary. The Senate will have to confirm those folks, and we don't believe there are any issues at this point. Wanted to say in terms of legislation, there hasn't been a whole slew of bills yet. But they are to come. And, we will be keeping people posted on some of the priority bills. One of the priority bills that we mentioned, have mentioned in previous meetings, Delegate Lori Charkoudian's Safe Roads Act has been introduced. There's no hearing scheduled yet. So, but, we're keeping an eye out for those things and then other things that pop up as usual. We will see the budget introduced on Friday, and we'll need a few days to pick it apart and see what's there and not. And the legislative bond request for funding for the library is in progress. So we haven't seen, it hasn't been introduced yet. It's not a bill per se, but they still have introductions of the letters requesting the funding. So that part hasn't happened yet, but everything is in progress for all of that. So it's light on the news because we're light on activity, but it's going to speed up real quick in the coming days.
So before I turn things over to my colleagues who may have questions, So I think this question is directed towards the city manager. So it was my understanding that we were not requesting a bond, that a proposal had not gone forward. We had asked for, okay.
So and that's my, it is, they are referred to in Annapolis as bond, it is grant dollars.
Okay. And so, but again, the council has not been formally presented on the nature of that proposal. And typically these, procedurally, we would vote to allow for that to move forward. And so I've asked, it would be great if the city manager could share with the council where the council voted in favor of moving this item forward into Annapolis, because it is my understanding that, as far as I could tell, that had not happened. So I just want to confirm that procedurally, before things, in terms of grant funds, whether it's the state or our legislators, those items are typically brought before council before they are submitted.
There hasn't been a vote of council. There was staff looking into the request, but council has not voted on those funds to move forward.
I apologize, and I don't know if this is in good order, Mayor, but can we do a motion here?
Councilmember Smalls, yes, you're free to make a motion.
I would move that the proposed bond with regard to bond or grant funds be withdrawn. If in theory, the actual proper procedures of the city, whether that be the actual execution of the council or anything to do with the purchasing ordinance and authorities to execute any sets of funds over $30,000. Yes, so I would be making a motion that we would withdraw that in good order and in good conscience.
Do we have any members that would like to second that motion?
I have a question about it, but I guess I have to wait.
Yep, it has to be seconded first.
I think it's, I'll second it just because I think it's good to discuss things.
Yeah.
Agree.
Okay, perfect. Councilmember Siemens seconds. Councilmember DeBala, your question?
Yeah, is it possible for us to get a copy of it and have it on the agenda for next week to read it and vote on it so it can go forward if we think it's appropriate?
Council already has it. It was sent to council last week. It's in your email box, and yes, we can put it on the agenda and have the director speak to it.
Again, it is my motion on the floor.
Sure.
I'd redirect in saying that in actuality, if it's the information that we have previously received, there's also been some pretty explicit conversations, both in this room and in others, about whether or not it was valid to move forward with such a thing, given the fact that the executing mechanisms of this particular city are the council. And so, again, I would argue that even if we had received it and were to receive it in some sort of order concerning this council at this particular time, it would essentially be a nullity because it was done without order and or without proper guidance prior to its inception. We did receive at least 2 proposals about it or outlines from different staff, but it is not a fait accompli to assume that just because we are told about something afterwards, that it's valid to do it in any given way, particularly if there are legal procedures that have to be observed. So I would entertain that my motion is entirely valid.
Councilmember DeBala?
A question for Council Member Smalls. So are you suggesting agreed that getting a copy of a proposal is not the same thing as approving the proposal? Are you suggesting that we put it on hold for a week so that we can vote on it next week? review it and vote on it next week?
I would argue specifically that if it is required to be rescinded in advance of the vote that would theoretically approve it, then that would be what would be required to happen. Just procedurally. I don't, if you want me to add to that, I would say that in the grand scheme of things, particularly if you're executing documents or professional contracts with third parties, if those third parties are to execute themselves or comport themselves with the wishes of the council, and the council hasn't expressed this wish, then it's bad for everybody. I mean, at some point, I'm going to ask about it again, is I guess what I would say.
I think, if I may, I think I understand what your point is, that the city council, as everybody seems to agree, has not formally approved this. Okay, so question for Anne. If we were to vote on this next week, could we say this week, well, on hold for now, don't bust a gut moving it this week, so we have a chance to review it and vote on it? I could put that in more formal language if you would like, but I think you got it.
So just in terms of process, we are not in a rush at the moment. We're not up on the deadline yet. So, I think another week doesn't, interfere, I think, with the process if you all decide to go ahead with this request for grant dollars.
And I would argue, with regard to the motion, that if, I would only amend my motion by a friendly amendment that would require that, no activities be taken on behalf of any grant dollars, for the library. But that is perhaps the only thing I'd be willing to do. And I'll just say again, that the reason for that would be that technically there are substantive public policy reasons to not be asking for a whole bunch more money, whether it be grants or otherwise, for the library. And so I'd like to discuss it because in the grand scheme of things, it has been an issue of continued disquiet for any number of people, and to backdoor funding for it when people already thought that the funding was taken care of is bad public policy.
Councilmember DeBala, your light's still on. Do you have any other questions? or
Well,
comments?
I think I follow this. And I think I would like to propose a friendly amendment to change the word withdraw to the word hold. Put on hold, no substantive activity till we have a chance to discuss and vote on this next week.
I would accept that as a friendly amendment.
Okay.
Me too.
So I just want to make sure, well, actually, I have a couple of questions myself. So Ann, can you just poor Ann, can you just walk us through the process? Because it was made clear to us during our District 20 discussion that there are new options for legislators to provide funding. So what mechanism is this grant being requested through? Like, how is that process working now in Annapolis?
Right. So actually, and just to let you know that this isn't part of the new process. This is part of the existing process they have in Annapolis. So it changed a few years ago. It used to be you had to have, for these kinds of requests that come through legislators at the district level, a request for funding. It has to be matching funding for a project that's shovel ready. So, some limited amount of criteria. Legislators from districts put forth their proposals for the projects in their districts. And then it's part of the capital budget. So the new process we talked about is the operating budget. But since this is capital money, these requests then toward the end of the budget process, toward the end of session, there is a set amount of money that gets basically divvied up among throughout the state, trying to fund different projects throughout the state. And so that becomes a lot of negotiating among the legislators, especially legislative leaders, about where that money will go. It is legislators who get to decide where that money goes. So,
The motion.
Okay, sorry, Ann, please continue.
and so that's the how that process works. And if I'm, well, I don't want to, I think that there had been a few years ago, one of these initiatives that contributed to the library, but you know, that may be a question to ask if there's going to be a presentation on this next week.
All right.
Mayor, I have a question about this, and then I'd prefer that we dispose of the motion at least, if possible. But I do have a question about
What I just asked. Okay, yep, please ask your follow-up.
With regard to the traditional bond and or grant process, if the primary distinction is often matching funds or whatever, and you have to have proof that you have a shovel-ready project. But the critical thing that you said was that the members of the legislative coalition are asked to advance such legislation or such proposal. Has there been a specific person who has been asked to advance this particular proposal?
In terms of legislators, the District 20 team has been presented with, you know, information related to.
No, that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is that with regard to any of the affidavits or things that you have to swear with regard to the project in order to prove that you have both the matching funds available and or that it's not just merely a bond, has anyone been actually executed to do those things?
I mean, it's literally a form that just says how much money you're looking for and what's the project. So that form was submitted. But that is the extent of it. Does that
Okay,
answer your
I guess
question?
what I would say in response to that is that that having been involved in the bond process and the grant process before, both for in general for buildings and for the additional grant funding for shovel-ready projects in other places, I do know that other than the requirement of whether or not you have the heft or political wherewithal to actually get your funding passed, there are some requirements, including testifying and any number of other things that would validate whether or not the other members of the body would vote for your thing. So there is a fair bit of horse trading that would be a component part of this in the natural legislative process as it stands. Correct? Like
That is one way to say it, yes.
Yes, we're asking to use the legislative wherewithal of the District 20 people in order to, and even perhaps their leadership positions, to ensure that we are going to get funding. That would be the political implications or any of those other things that would be associated with it. It's the reason why you would go after any sort of things like seniority. And so if that's the case and the dollars are finite, wouldn't it be a bad idea to move forward under the assumption that we have approved something that we didn't approve if we are actually potentially implicating people who are in the leadership of the state government?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. I'm sorry. You know, this is.
It's okay.
Yeah, I think this is more of a question that we need to make sure that our staff are aware of the political implications of moving forward with activities such as these without receiving prior council approval ahead of time. And you mentioned that we've informed our District 20 delegation. Was there more in-depth for communication on this matter besides, you know, mentioning it during our District 20 delegation meetings?
There was a form filled out and submitted to the District 20 team. that again requested the amount of money and what the project is.
What's total amount? Oh, I'm sorry.
And was the, I guess this question is for the city manager, what was the amount that was proposed?
I don't have it in front of me, but I believe the request was for 2 million. Correct me if I'm wrong, and I want to say it was for 2 million because it was matching of the 4 million. And just going back, when this first came up last year, it was, the legislature was just ending or still in session, and we had brought up ARPA, and this conversation came around ARPA where council wanted us to try to leverage the ARPA funds as much as we can. And talking about the library, figuring out how we can find other dollars. And so when we were kind of tasked with looking at other funding before you all designated the additional 2 million that you had on hold, staff was running down every hole that we could to figure out other streams to be able to put towards this. So I just want to just make sure that that's where this came from during that discussion about almost a year ago.
Can I make a point of
Councilmember
order?
Small, if you could
I'm sorry.
hold off until,
Can we just,
thank you.
So I just want to just put that on record because this came from that discussion we had when the previous council voted on ARPA, and that discussion before you all put the 2 million on hold. And so we went back and forth and tried to run it down. And that's where at that time is figuring out, talking with Ann and our director of library, talk with Ann and figure out what other streams of grant funding that is out there that we can actually put into. That way, whatever we were able to get, of course, we would bring that to council and council vote on it, but we were hoping to figure out what's out there in the universe. That way we can bring back, and that will free up money because that was one of the tasks that the previous council had asked us to look at during that discussion.
Well, because we do have a motion to get back to, I would argue that we've done this before, and it would have behooved us to follow the process that we did before, where we requested these types of grant funds, and the process that was used, the matter was brought before council, the council voted, and there was a resolution where we allowed staff and approved staff to move forward. It also enabled the council to leverage its political will with the District 20 delegation to make sure they understood the gravity of the need of the funds and were able to actually help champion that charge for us. So I want to turn things over to Councilmember Siemens, but I do think that it's important to note that this process fell completely, as Councilmember Smallins has said, it's fallen completely out of procedurally the process that we take for these kinds of activities. And it should have come before council. And if it was being discussed last year, when we were talking through ARPA, then the prior council, it should have come before that council, so that they could make the decision around, yes, please continue to pursue these options, including additional grant funds from the state. With that, I'll turn things over to Councilmember Siemens, whose light is on.
Thank you, ma'am. I just wanted to check, you talked about, you have submitted this form, and has this come up in conversation yet with the District 20 delegation?
They've received the form.
Okay,
There hasn't been anything more formal than that.
okay. So if we place this on hold for a week, then you may need to tell them that it is on hold for a week, or again, I don't want to see us going out and advocating for something that we're going to later tell some other district that we're withdrawing if it doesn't pass next week. I don't want to burn up the capital that you're thinking about or talking about. So that's something you'd be able to do, is just let our delegation know. All right,
Yes.
appreciate that. And Mr. Fox, I want to thank you for thinking about additional funding. And I encourage you to keep in mind the different roles between the city manager and the council. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor. Councilmember Small, I just want to make sure that I accurately, yeah, restate it.
I'd go with the motion as pertaining to the friendly amendment from Councilwoman DeBala, that the bond grant request receive no official activity on behalf of the town until such time as a vote is held that may potentially approve it.
Okay. Any second to, and so Councilmember DeBala, okay. All those in favor of that amendment, please say aye.
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 All those opposed? I'm an aye. Okay, so I will work to get a vote. Can staff make sure that we're able to have a session on this next week so that we're able to vote on it? All right. Thank you so much, Anne. I appreciate you bearing with us tonight. And look forward to continuing to engage with you during this legislative session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I do have one other question
Wait,
unrelated to.
Sorry, we have another question. Councilmember Small, your light is on.
Oh, my bad.
Thank you. Sorry, Anne, before you leave, Councilmember DeBala has another question for you.
Thank you. And this may be a question for the mayor. I'm not sure. Just firming up the process by which Anne interacts with either a subcommittee of us or interacts with us on basis, us, the council and the city manager, based on our, or works with us based on our identified interests. I'm not sure I remember which way we went with that. For the quick turnaround.
The quick turnaround items. So if I remember correctly, everyone submitted what they believe their legislative priorities or topics would be. And correct me if I'm wrong, we're preparing the big matrix. If I remember correctly, we would have the matrix with the items that are coming through, and you've been made aware of where current council members' priorities are, where we're kind of flagging things accordingly. In terms of next steps for items that may require testimony or a group of council members to kind of comb through. My understanding, and city manager, correct me if I'm wrong, that the idea was there was going to be a first read based on the priorities that have already been identified, and the items would be flagged for us. But I'm happy to have us put together a subcommittee of council members who would be at the ready to kind of comb through that massive list if we need to. But my understanding was that between Anne, you and the city manager and staff, that and the priorities that we've identified, there would be a kind of culling of the volume of things that are coming through.
Yes, between my office and I believe going through and it'll be limited, so it wouldn't be that 100-page document that we reviewed in the committee meeting.
Just get it down to 20 or 30.
Okay, because I think that was the main issue, because the prior subcommittee had to go through that big volume. So,
But then we will
But then
have.
from
a
there-
Okay, so when would you want volunteers for the subcommittee? Do you want us to contact you separately?
yes, if members of council, we could put together a 3-member subcommittee that would be at the ready to review the streamlined version of bills that our legislative, that Anne and staff have kind of culled through to kind of help us with prioritizing. If you are interested in participating in that subcommittee, please just shoot me a note and let me know. Yes, Councilmember Gibson.
Yes, just a question. If I understood correctly, the city manager working with Ann would pull together or would cull this larger list, and then that would become to a group of council members. I guess I'm just concerned about any culling because all of us gave our priorities and they should all be in some way identifiable, I would think. I mean, I don't know what's the decision-making process for there were two people that suggested this and one person suggested this, and so we'll just, I mean, the process of decision-making is what I'm asking about.
Sure. And I know that you had mentioned this during your presentation when we were here with the District 20 delegation and we had the kind of walkthrough. And you talked a little bit about the process that you try to use when you're looking through bills. And it's not just limited to the topic or whether or not two members are interested or not, but also as it relates to the viability of the bill, will it likely make it out and see the light of day? Can you just kind of brief us again on that aspect of how you are kind of viewing the bills and the process you use to try to keep us from spending a lot of time reviewing things that may not make it out?
Certainly, and it's not an exact science, but based on experience, based on discussions with legislators, you look at things related to, I mean, when we take a big issue like the environment, there are going to be, dozens and dozens of bills related to the environment. So it's really about trying to figure out what are the things that are, most impactful. I mean, I think that's the first thing. What's the most impactful on, the city of Tacoma Park and the people that live there? You have to look at the viability of the bill. And that may be, related to who the sponsor is. It might be related to the fiscal note on the bill, how much it's going to cost. There could be just the feasibility of implementation that will impact whether or not the bill has a good chance of success. We certainly rely on input from not just the District 20 team. We rely on a lot of feedback from other legislators, from staffers who are working on bills. So it's really looking at all of that. And then part of what we do as well is try to figure out what is there something that Tacoma Park's participation in terms of testifying on a bill or writing support for a bill makes a difference. Like it is a unique perspective. It is based on some experience. We have that going on with ranked choice voting issues right now. Tacoma Park keeps getting asked about how it's working in Tacoma Park. So are there things specific that would be helpful to the conversation around any proposal from Tacoma Park specifically? So those are all the things that go into consideration when we are looking at, should we bother you with this bill? That's kind of what it comes down to. If it's a bill that just has no shot for whatever that reason is, it's not necessarily worth bringing it to you.
Councilmember, I'm sorry, go ahead, Councilmember Gibson.
Yes, that is helpful. Being entirely new to this process in terms of what I submitted, what each of us submitted, the level of detail. I'd like to, please, I'm sure you'll do a good job with putting together something based on the criteria that you mentioned. I'd also like to see all of those items that dropped off, just as to see what the universe looks like in a way, because I don't know. I just want to see what the universe is, which is really the priorities of this group here, some way or another to capture. And I don't I don't think I need an explanation for why they dropped off, but at least that it be so noted.
I think Councilmember DeBala, do you have a follow-up to
I have a
that
follow-up
point?
question. And about how many bills were there last year? The universe is pretty big. Was it?
On that I flagged for Tacoma Park?
No, that of if
Were
I-
introduced?
Yeah, that were introduced. It was tens of thousands, wasn't it?
Not quite that high, but somewhere
Somewhere
between 2 and 3,000.
2 and 3,000. Do you keep them in a database?
No, they exist. There's no reason to keep them in a database.
Because the database
They
exists
exist on the General Assembly's
On the General
website.
Assembly website.
So if I might follow up, so I wasn't asking for all of the
Oh, okay.
bills. I was asking for all of our priorities that
Oh.
didn't link up with a bill that's held as viable or et cetera. So,
Okay.
again,
Yeah,
it's to
yeah.
get the universe that I
that's-
was referring to,
Sure,
primarily is the
sure.
universe of what we, the seven of us, put forward.
Sure. Okay, that can be done. And when we prepare, the first round of, the list that we share in city manager as well, if we could just make sure that everyone is aware of all of the priority areas that have been identified for the city. And then that way, council members will be aware, because some of them are actually just more or less longstanding, areas that we focused on. So, in addition to the items or priorities that you all have individually shared. Okay. Are there any other? Okay, perfect. Excellent. So, and just so that we'll recap, when you, we will, let me know, folks, let me know if you would like to be on the 3 council member subcommittee that would be responsible for just kind of being in the know and kind of looking at the call list of bills, with an eye for whether or not we may need to testify or write in testimony on a particular, item or assist, in that effort. And will provide us, the city manager Fox will provide us with, the list of the cold list of bills that we're carrying up, that we are going to pay attention to, as well as the list of priority topics that we're using to identify, priorities. Okay, awesome. Well, this time, I think you may be free to leave for real, Anne. So thank you so much again for, working with us, and we will see you next week.
Great, thank you all.
Have a good one. All right, so next, we're moving on to public comments. We don't have any voting items tonight, but if you have comments on any non-voting, items, please feel free to come up to the podium. Yes. Chris? Yeah.
Thank you. Do I do something here?
Nope, I think your mic is on,
Oh, I'm sorry.
and you have 3 minutes.
My glasses, I beg your pardon.
No problem. I can relate.
Good evening. My name is Christine Simpson. I live in Ward 1. I'm here tonight just to encourage the council to take an interest in the changes that are being proposed at the Tacoma Metro Station. And I want to especially thank Mayor Searcy and council members Fulcher and Small for attending last night's hearing, WMATA hearing. As you all may know, WMATA Metro is proposing to change the Tacoma Station to accommodate a significant development at the site that will include housing and retail, but that could also curtail certain transit functions of the station. Whatever one's view of what's happening at the Tacoma Metro Station, I believe the development will have a major impact on Tacoma Park, Maryland residents, and that it deserves the attention of this council. My opinion is that we should strive to have a development that does not interfere with the transit functioning of the station, that provides needed housing, including affordable housing, and that results in a building whose height and massing are compatible with the adjacent Tacoma Park community. I hope that you will participate on our behalf so that we can have a result that our community can be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other, we don't provide feedback?
Okay, I didn't know.
Yeah, no worries. Yes, sure.
Hello, my name is Anderson. I'm from Ward 2, and I'd like to comment on the subcommittee that you mentioned. I'd really like to encourage Jason Smalls to participate in that subcommittee. I like his argument, and just to clarify, this is my first time. I'd like to get involved in the local government, and I'd like to encourage the youth to get more involved into things like this, because as I see, this room is pretty empty. So that's pretty much it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Any more comments? Hello, Brendan,
Hey,
and
would request
5 minutes.
That work?
Yes, you will
Okay.
receive 5 minutes.
Great,
If you could just make
thanks.
sure the clock reflects that.
Hi, everybody. My name is Brendan Smith. I'm a Ward 3 city resident, the city's Arts and Humanities Coordinator, and the president of AFSCME Local 3399, which represents most City of Tacoma Park employees. I'm here to speak about several issues that directly impact the health and safety of city employees and the need for more open communication between city management, city employees, and the city council. The current hiring freeze was enacted by the city manager without any input from union leaders or apparently even from the city council. We weren't notified about the freeze, and I only received the complete list of vacant positions a few hours ago because the city manager required that we file a public records request through the Maryland Public Information Act just to receive one piece of paper. There are more than 25 vacant positions now across almost every city department, and this isn't a new problem. We had a hiring freeze 2 years ago, or 3 actually, I guess, and we still haven't recovered from it. Common practice of city management with the previous consent of the city council has been to leave positions vacant and then force the remaining employees to not only do their own jobs, but the duties of these vacant positions without any additional overtime, raises, or promotions. This hiring freeze may look good on paper as far as reducing the budget, but it represents real harms that are being carried out against all city employees, not just our members. Multiple departments, including Housing Community Development, Human Resources, are working at half staffing or less without any reduction in workload. City employees are experiencing low morale, undue stress, negative impacts on their mental and physical health, and other threats to their health and safety because of these issues. Ultimately, there may be accidents on the job because of overwork that could lead to OSHA complaints, workers' comp disability payments, lawsuits, and class action grievances and arbitrations from our members. State of affairs is a vicious cycle because city employees get burned out and they quit because they can find more respect and better pay elsewhere in a tight labor market. That creates more vacant positions and more turnover, so the city never has a stable workforce, and the word gets out that you shouldn't work for the city of Tacoma Park. Our members met today in a union-wide meeting and unanimously approved the following resolution about these issues. The resolution states, we call on city management and the city council to end this hiring freeze immediately because it threatens the health and safety of city employees. The freeze also unfairly demands that city employees perform additional work outside of their job duties. Necessary overtime needs to be provided until all vacant positions are filled. Our contract also requires that raises be provided to any union members who perform the essential duties of a higher job classification for more than 5 workdays. On a related issue, there have been ongoing efforts by city management to shut down sort of communication between the city council, union leaders, city employees. I think you heard some of that at your meeting last week. The council should take a more proactive role in protecting the rights of city employees to uphold commitments to progressive values, including racial equity, income equality, and just basic fair treatment and respect. In the past, we've only heard silence from the city council when we've raised important issues, and there hasn't been any public oversight or accountability of the city manager's actions. 7 of you are responsible for overseeing and directing the city manager. You're his boss, so you should be providing direction. One of former Mayor Kate Stewart's last actions in office was to lead the hiring of a labor consultant to improve communications. The consultant's initial report called for labor relations training for all parties and a joint working group where we'd actually talk to each other and work things out. The previous council actually approved a contract for this work, but I spoke to a consultant today, and he said he hasn't heard from anybody in the 2 or 3 months that have passed since the resolution was approved by the council. So we're calling on the council to sort of immediately put that into effect as far as that contract, and to start these meetings with a labor consultant to try to create sort of a more collaborative approach to resolve some of these issues instead of it always being a combative process. So requesting that, and then the instructing the city manager to lift the hiring freeze and instructing approval for overtime raises and promotions that are needed because of the vacant positions or that are required under the ASME contract. We're always ready and willing to talk to any of you, and happy to answer any questions. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Do you have any other public comments tonight? Any virtual comments? Okay, perfect. So we will move on to council comments. Okay, Councilmember Small.
I'm happy to defer to anyone else if they'd like to go first, just so you know. But I will go.
Yep, you're first in line.
All right. Thank you, Mayor. Can I get the number? Word. So I just wanted to say that with regard to issues presented in this public forum or any other one, they are of gravity and import to me. And I guess I would say by way of introduction, since I just allegedly interrupted a process that actually was probably not a real process. And I also have on a baseball hat. My name is Jason Small. I am the Ward 6 representative. I went to Yale Law School. I am also a political science major, undergrad, and member of Phi Sigma Alpha, Phi Beta Kappa. I have a tendency to use big words when I talk fast, and I'm going to talk fast because I'm going to try and honor that number. I would just like to say that as a basis of my experience in political science, ideal theory, or anything else, I'm a very big proponent of rule-based systems, which means that if you have a set of rules, that you have to stick to them. Any number of reasons. One of the reasons primarily is because I'm black, and when you have rules and you know what they are, it's a lot safer than when you are required to hold on to the favor of any given person. And so I'm very much interested in that as a personal premise in my own life. But also personally, I have direct experience in a lot of different levels of government, including municipal government. And one of the things that I am aware of is that there are a variety of things that are required by both the Open Meetings Act and the Maryland Home Rule Statute about how things are supposed to be done, and or there's a general paradigm that all of the municipalities in the area use. And I just gotta say, it just doesn't seem like we do a lot of that. There are reasons, I suppose. I think the budget is strange. We'll get to that in a little bit. But any number of things, including the effective administration of government, means that you actually have to be able to do the things that you were supposed to do and be informed of them. And so sunshine is a very important part of the process. I guess I would say that to say that if it seems that the efficacy of being on this board and speaking for 3 minutes is such that I am going to be apoplectic every now and then and pop off on the record or abuse my position with regard to Robert's Rules of Order, I sincerely apologize. But at a base level, if you have rules and they're arbitrarily applied, or you have rules and they're not applied fairly, then what you end up with is not privilege, but favor. And favor is bad, because lots of people think, oh, privilege, you can't be talking to me. But if you are not doing things the way they are supposed to be done, then you are cheating the systems, and that's bad for a government.
Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. I would just like to request a copy of the latest equipment replacement reserve as for a first step towards the budget process for this coming year. Thank you.
Councilmember DeBala.
Yeah, and here I thought, I wanted to thank the police department and Councilmember Small for the Ward 6 safety, public safety meeting the other night. It was very helpful to a bunch of Ward 2 residents, talking about recent shed burglaries and what's going on in town. So thanks a lot for that. I got a lot of thank yous tonight. There's a stop sign, a four-way stop at Ethan Allen and Elm, and it went in on Saturday with, I understand there to be one exception. It's been going pretty well. The one exception was an accident on Saturday night. Somebody who either didn't know or didn't care that there was a stop sign. So I'm asking for, I have asked and received more police attention on the corner in the short run, and I'm asking for some additional temporary signage for the east-west, the Ethan Allen stretch, so that we can really get the message home to people that there's a change in that traffic pattern. But thank you to all the residents, thank you to the city staff, and to former Mayor Kate Stewart, and to our delegate Lori Trikudian, because it takes a village to get a stop sign in, apparently. Also, one last thank you to the residents, nearly 30 of them, who showed up on Martin Luther King Day to work in Dorothy's Woods, and then there was a whole bunch more people earlier in the day of service at Tacoma Woods, which perhaps somebody else will comment on. But the tradition continues, and I feel good about it. I wanted to mention to my colleagues that this week on Thursday and on Friday, there are two Council of Government committee meetings. One is the Energy and Environment Committee will be at the auto show looking at electric vehicles. I've got my pass. I'm really excited about it, actually. Get to see the latest, including apparently the new truck that the city might at some point purchase. And on Friday, the Chesapeake Bay meeting. Tomorrow night, there's an MML chapter committee meeting with the county executive. If anybody is attending, I'd like to see if I could hook a ride with you one way or the other. All right, okay, we'll work it out. And last but not least, I would like to ask, as one of the council members who was around for the voting on the union contract, I'd like to ask the city manager for an update on the status of that, either right now or how would you like to do this? An update on the status of the union contract. Do you want to hear it now or-
Council member, the union contract is going to be next Monday. at
Okay,
closed session.
great. That takes care of that then. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Gibson?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank all of the public commenters, Ms. Simpson, Mr. Anderson, and Mr. Smith. All three of those points I'm trying to take in and see what can be done. I need to learn more, but I appreciate it very much, the people coming out at this time of night and speaking on those subjects. Cindy or Council Member Davala, no. I wanted to say thanks to the Friends of Dorothy's Woods as well. Yes. They did a great job, not only pulling, just pulling up trash, but pulling lots of wineberry out. It was a good day, and I want to hold up that group, that Friends of Dorothy's Woods, and that there were lots of kids out there, lots of families. It was a fun event, beautiful day. I want to also commend the police department and Council Member Small in terms of the public safety workshop or forum that was held, and want to say that Ward 3 has had its share of some crimes, and we will be holding a public safety event tentatively scheduled for February 26th. Let you know on that. So, thank you. That's it.
Councilmember Honzak?
Thank you, Mayor Searcy. I also want to say a number of thank yous. I want to start though with just a little sharing. Councilmember Fulcher and I were able to carve out some time in our schedules the last 2 days to attend a Day of Racial Healing conference down at the Museum of the Native Americans. And it was really an amazing event. I wished that all of our council members could have had the opportunity to come. I'm sure everyone had different commitments and jobs during the day. I wished even that some of our staff could have joined us, but we would be happy to do, maybe a short share out of some of the big takeaways. And I'd like to also learn more about the history that the incumbents and the previous mayor took to move forward on racial equity. Anyway, it was very inspiring. And I hope that we can take some meaningful steps forward, and I'm ready to help champion that along with fellow council members and the mayor. And then I want to say thank you to Chief Duvall and his entire team who came out to Essex House yesterday and had a fantastic community meeting with 30 or 40 people in the building and really talked through a whole array of issues that have been on people's minds. I think it was really a wonderful moment post-pandemic to kind of reconnect after a few years, and really just, it was one of the first times they'd all gotten together in a long time to talk about all kinds of things. So thank you. And then I want to acknowledge the three people who came out tonight and took their time to talk to us. With respect to, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the names, Christine Simpson, and the concerns you brought forward. I'm sorry that all of us could not be there last night. We had this police meeting that was planned before I got notice of that meeting. But we are planning as a council, I think, to try to get together and make a written statement, all of us, and put our thoughts together and our heads together as much as possible on that. So I think we've all taken that very seriously, that call to action. And I think it's also imperative that we get more youth out. So look forward to hearing more from you. Maybe informally we can talk about what we can do as council members to support that. And then lastly, Mr. Smith, I thank you so much for coming out tonight. And I just want to say a huge thank you to every single staff member that is bearing with us throughout the pandemic. This has been a really hard time, and I can only imagine what all of you have been through. You are working hard. We are hearing you, and we know that you're under a lot of stress, and we are doing all that is in our power, both here on the dais and behind the doors, to sort of try to address these concerns, and we hope you will bear with us through these times. We do hear you. Thank you.
Councilmember Fulcher.
So I was at the Tacoma Woods cleanup, and it was like standing room only. Lots and lots of people showed up. I want to thank Howard Cohn and Jay Keller were there handing out the gloves and the bags. And I also want to thank Director of Public Works, Daryl Braithwaite. A group of 8th grade girls were pulling a giant thing of cement out from the gully there, and I wasn't thinking about the boundaries and that we were in a Montgomery County piece of property, and they got tired. They left it next to the skate park, and Daryl has agreed to go and get that picked up for me, and I realized that that was a little extra that she's doing. Super appreciate it. I had the best Dr. Martin Luther King birthday weekend ever. I went to the Strathmore to see Montgomery County's performances, and I highly recommend that everybody try to get there next year. The music was amazing. And, also the 2 days of the National Day of Healing were really great. And I also want to point out to residents, if you haven't come to see the artwork that is right now in the community center, it is really, really amazing. And so I want to thank the Arts and Humanities Department in Tacoma Park for putting that together, and just urge everybody to make that a part of your celebration of Black History Month that's coming up, to come and check out that art, because it's 4 Black female artists that made that art, and it's amazing.
Great. Well, one thing that is nice when you go last is lots of folks have already covered your topics. So I just want to thank all of the groups that facilitated Service Day activities over the course of Monday and this weekend, the Tacoma Woods cleanup, Dorothy's Woods, as well as Tommy's Pantry. I was able to make a donation at the co-op on Monday for Tommy's Pantry's MLK donation drive, so I'm appreciative of that. On Sunday, I had the opportunity to serve as the keynote speaker for the Fair Housing Symposium, if I can get the word out, which was hosted by Councilmember Mitchell of the city of Laurel, and was joined by Will Jawando and a number of other folks who are really pushing at a higher level, state level for transformation in terms of housing policies. And so that was a pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak at that event. Also had the chance to attend on Monday the MLK Roundtable on Childhood Hunger. That was hosted by MANA. It was a great roundtable discussion. Council President Gabe Abernos was there, or he was president was there, and it was really helpful to hear so much about policies that may be coming down the pike in Annapolis, but also things that may be happening in the county that would help with addressing food insecurity in our area. So that was really great to participate in. Also on Monday, I had the chance to attend the 46th annual MLK Scholarship Breakfast for the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, and so many folks were there to break bread, but also be in celebration of all of the wonderful work that so many Black and brown men in our community are doing. And so that was a wonderful opportunity to participate in that as well. I will be at the MML meeting tomorrow. I also had the opportunity on Thursday to attend, I'm sorry, that wasn't Thursday, that was Tuesday, I can't read my handwriting, the Tacoma Metro meeting, and I want to echo Councilmember Hanzak's point that we will be definitely working with WMATA and working with the developers to make sure that we're able to promote our goals of housing creation and desperately needed development, but in a smart way that benefits the people in our community. And then lastly, I just want to echo the point raised earlier about appreciation of our staff. We are only what we are as a city because of the wonderful people that work in our city. And so it's critically important that we are taking the necessary steps to make sure that the city of Tacoma Park is a great place to work. And we're providing a safe, welcoming environment for not only our residents, but our employees as well. So with that, I think I've covered everything. And so we will be able to move over to the city manager's comments.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Nothing this evening.
Perfect. So adoption of minutes. So we have on the agenda to a vote for the December 7th minutes.
I'd like to move that.
Second?
Second.
Okay. Are there any edits or concerns? Sure.
Councilmember Small had, we had talked, and he had suggested we push them back. He had suggested I add a little context about some of the priorities that the council and the delegation shared and considered doing together moving forward.
Okay.
So I can make those revisions.
And then
for
we'll-
next week, we'll have them for you.
Okay.
We table it?
So we will table the 12-7 minutes to next week. All right. So now we're going to turn things over to our city manager, who will be providing us with a presentation on the fiscal health of the city.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. This evening is a pleasure for our team to come before you to share the fiscal health of the organization and to open up a dialogue for council and members of the community to know kind of where we are fiscally, and we'll provide some information as relates to our budget and be here to answer any questions that you have at the end. I'm going to turn it over to Director Chung, who's going to walk us through the fiscal health presentation.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and the councilmen. I am Susan Chung. I'm the Finance Director of the City of Tacoma Park. Welcome to this fiscal health presentation tonight. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to talk briefly about some financial terms. As you may already know, the presentation includes some budget information as well as financial information, and it could be sometimes confusing if we do not clarify the source and also the meaning of the data. So I would like to first talk about the budget. This is one of the most significant financial management tools of a city, and is the annual budget process. The annual budget provides a legal plan for expenditure and a basis for control over municipal operations throughout the fiscal year. The city charter mandates a budget be adopted prior to the beginning of the fiscal year. For the city of Tacoma Park, the city manager's proposed budget is submitted at the beginning of the April, and the city's fiscal year begins in July 1st. I would like to talk about financial statements. And this is part of the information that is going to be included in this presentation as well. Financial statements are documents that summarizing the actual financial situation or performance of the city. Actual results are known and published at the end of the fiscal year in the city's annual comprehensive financial report, and we call it ACFR, with the auditor's opinion. For the city of Tacoma Park, the fiscal period is closed at June 30th every year. The annual report is presented in October and then is presented to the council in November. And we just had a presentation of fiscal year 22 financial statement with the auditing firm called Barbara King Thornton. And this is first year that we have this audit firm and preparing our audit. I would like to talk about one of the financial document in our annual report, and it is called the Budget and Expense and Actual Expenses. And it is included in the financial report called Budgetary Comparison Statement. And that is on page 41 of our fiscal year 22 annual report. The statement is helpful by displaying the original budget, the final budget, and the actual amount of our expenditure and revenue. The budget variance is the difference between the budgeted expense or revenue and the actual amount. The budget variance is favorable when the actual revenue is higher than the budget, or when the actual expenditure is less than the budget. So these are the background information I want to introduce before this presentation, because a lot of these terms appear in the presentation. Okay, let's begin with the first. I'm very proud to be working in the city of Tacoma Park. The city has a history of solid financial management. The city has maintained a stable reserve balance, and the bond payments are usually paid on time, always pay on time. And there are many other cities and who cannot say the same thing, cities that did not address the factor causing structural deficit, and over time it ended up depleting their reserve. And before we actually have this fiscal year 2018 reserve policy adopted, I actually did a lot of reserve in our surrounding cities, and I found that a lot of these cities in the surrounding area did not have the reserve, the quantity of the reserve as well as the quality of the reserve. So I'm very pleased to let you know that we have different type of reserve in the city, and a lot of them has good quality. So In the city, by following the reserve policy established in 2018, we continue to maintain sufficient rainy day reserve, control expenditures, incremental increases over time, identify new revenue source, and fiscal health practice to make sure we maintain in good fiscal health. So the next slide is about our budgetary and financial goals. And basically, we have two very important goals that we want to achieve. The first one is to fund and sustain city services at a level that meet the needs of the Tacoma Park residents. The second goal is to provide financial resources to accomplish the city council priorities. So how do we accomplish these goals? And there are two ways we can do that. First, by maintaining a structurally balanced budget. And what is a balanced budget? A balanced budget is ongoing expenditure funded with ongoing revenue. And the second way to achieve it is by adhering to the financial and budgetary policy and best practices. First of all, to adhere to the reserve policy, to protect our reserve. And secondly, to follow the GASB rule, the GAAP. GASB is Government Accounting Standard Board. GAAP is Generally Accepted Accounting Principle, and also to implement the best practices of GFOA. GFOA stands for Government Finance Officers Association. Next, we're going to talk about the overview of the city's fund structure. The city's budget consists of 4 primary funds. General fund can be used for discretionary spending, while there are 3 other funds have their restricted for limited purpose. A 5th fund was created in fiscal year 22 and is called ARPA. ARPA stands for American Rescue Plan Act. And we actually receive a total of $17.5 million from the Treasury. And first, the most important fund is general fund. And we also have a special revenue fund that represents most of the state and the county and the other local government grants. Speed Camera Fund is also a special purpose fund for police. Also the Stormwater Fund, we all know about that. And also lastly is the ARPA Fund. So we're looking out at the general fund revenue. In the financial statement of fiscal year 22, we can see that general fund represents 89% of the city's revenue. And 91% of the general fund revenue comes from 3 main sources. That is the property tax, mainly the real property tax, as well as the personal property tax. And that is about 53% in fiscal year 22. Intergovernmental revenue that represent those revenue that are being transferred and funded by the local government, actually by Montgomery County, by the state, and the federal, okay? And I can name a few of those intergovernmental revenue, and that includes the police protection, FEMA grant from the federal government, library aid, police rebate, in lieu of police, in lieu of road maintenance, in lieu of parks maintenance, in lieu of crossing guard, hotel, motel tax, cable and franchise fee. And those are the categories of our intergovernmental revenue. And the intergovernmental revenue actually make up 24% of our total revenue. And the next one is the income tax that makes about 14%. The remaining revenue comes from the charges of service. The city actually charge some fees for the services that we provide. For example, the recreation department have a lot of different type of activities, and we do make some charges when we provide those services. Next slide. We're talking about the general fund expenditure. And this is the actual financial performance from fiscal year 18 through fiscal year 22. And the information from the total revenue, total expenditure, deficit, or surplus is coming from our income statement. Bond reserve, unassigned reserve, committed reserve are coming from our balance sheet, okay, from all those years. And you can see that there are special area in this particular table that shows the highlighted red, that is representing our deficit. So for fiscal year 18, we have a deficit of 94,000. 19, we have 1.3 million. 20, we have a deficit of 378,000. 2021, we have a deficit of 951. But in 2022, we do have a surplus of 958,000. And I want to explain later on the city's surplus of 958 is mainly due to a one-time revenue source. And I will explain later what this one-time revenue source is, okay? Next. This is a bar graph that actually represents the same information that we saw on the last slide, but it is in a graphic information. So the orange bar represents the revenue. In 2019, we have 20.7 million in revenue, but our expenditure is 27 million. And then that's why we have a deficit of 1.3 million. And the same thing in 2020, we have a deficit of 378. In 2021, we have a deficit of 951,000. In 2022, we do have a surplus of 958,000. This is a long-term historical trend of our financial performance. The orange line represents our expenditure. The revenue line is in red. And then at the bottom, you can see a green line, and that represents our deficit and surplus situation of the last 10 years. So you can tell from the green line at the bottom, we can see with those numbers in bracket, out of 10 years, we have 5 years in actual deficit. So so when we have deficit, I mean the funds, the deficit amount is being drawn from our reserve. So next slide, please. So because of this condition, our financial condition in the past few years, we look into the GFOA recommendation. The GFOA recommended the government should establish a formal policy on the level of unrestricted fund balance that should be maintained in a general fund for budgetary and emergency purposes. And they recommended, at a minimum, the general purpose government should maintain at least 2 months' worth of the operating revenue or regular general fund operating expenditure. For City of Tacoma Park, that is about 4.3 million or 2.15 million per month. And the normal practice during the proposed budget, the city manager usually maintains $2 to $3 million in our unassigned reserve during the budget time. In 2018, the Tacoma Park City Council established a reserve policy of maintaining the assigned reserve, the unassigned reserve, at a level no less than 17% of our total general fund revenue. In 2022, the city's unassigned reserve is right at target, is at 17%, or $4.6 million. This particular slide shows our adopted budget. So you remember the last slide with the line graph is our 10-year financial performance. This one actually shows our 10-year adopted budget in relation to the revenue, expenditure, as well as our reserve amount. And I did make some change on this particular graph because I found some mistake when I was reviewing it. So sorry that this mistake was just found, and it's for 2018. 2018, you can see the orange line, which is expenditure, is much higher than the revenue line, which is in blue. And that is because this is the year that we obtain or issue the bond fund. We actually issued 2 bonds during that year, and one is for the transportation bond, and the other one is for the library bond. And for some reason, when we were doing the adopted budget, we were having a very lofty goal of actually spend the entire bond fund in the whole year. So that's why the adopted budget total amount is much higher than the revenue because of the capital improvement project. They include the library construction as well as the transportation construction, that total about $9 million. And at the same time, why do we have a surplus during that year? It's because we do receive the grant fund, the bond fund of $9 million. So with that, even though our expenditure is higher than our revenue because of the offset of the bond fund, so we're still showing a surplus in our budget of 2018. So I apologize for the mistake, but this is being corrected. So the next slide is actually just showing our unassigned reserve. The unassigned reserve is showing in 2 colors. One is orange, and that is our actual unassigned reserve. The one in yellow is actually what we call the designate for subsequent year occur when the budget expenditure exceed the budget revenue in a given budget year. So we need to save and put some money in the reserve called designate for subsequent year to save that money in our unassigned reserve, just in case since our adopted budget expenditure is higher than our revenue. So this is a recommendation in fiscal year 22 by our auditor, our new auditor, Barbara King Thornton, not to maintain that designated for subsequent year reserve in the unassigned reserve, and we move that to the committed reserve. So it's in a different reserve. So you can see that our fiscal year 22, the unassigned reserve is showing $4.6 million. The remaining $3.3 million is put into the committed reserve with the recommendation of our auditor. So actually, both our committed reserve and the unassigned reserve can be used with the direction of the council. So the council can actually move the funds from the committed reserve to the unassigned reserve. So it's just telling us that why are we segregating it? It's because we need to realize that during the budget time, we do have higher expenditure than revenue. Next slide. So this is a request by our city manager. I come up with this particular slide and actually reflect our fiscal year 23, our current budget information. And you can see that from the far left column is our adopted 23 budget, and this is only the expenditure side. And you can see that from the adopted budget, we had a total expenditure of $34 million. And because of the capital outlay of $6.7 million, $5 million is in the library bond. So excluding the use of the library bond, the $5 million, our net deficit is only $2 million. Okay, so, and then we have the first budget amendment. The first budget amendment includes two particular items here. One is called carryover. The other one is called budget increase. The total carryover is $2,020,000. The budget increase was $142,877. And the second budget amendment is mainly including our salary increase. And the salary increase were for the police supervisor in the amount of $142,000. Salary increase for the non-union employees was for $96,000. Salary increase for the union employee was totaling $80,000. So the total salary increase in general fund, it was $317,000. With the adopted budget of the total expenditure of $34 million, plus the two budget amendments, our current adjusted budget total is the addition of $34 million plus the budget amendment. It has been increased to $36.6 million. Okay, so our original budget deficit was $2 million. Because of the two budget amendments, now our deficit is showing up as $4.5 million. So I want to talk about a little bit about carryover, because there was a lot of confusion about what that term means, okay? The term carryover is actually very misleading. Oftentimes, carryover are referred to budget expenditure items that was obligated in the prior fiscal year, but due to some unforeseen reasons, the project cannot be completed and needed to be carried forward to the current fiscal year. Hence, the unfinished project costs must be appropriated and expended in the current fiscal year. Technically, expenditure cannot be carried over to the next fiscal year. Revenue, expenditures, and dividends are in the temporary account. These accounts must be closed at the end of the fiscal year. And during the year-end closing, if expenditures are higher than revenue, the actual financial would indicate an actual deficit. If the revenue is higher than the expenditure, it would be a surplus. An alternative way to avoid constant carryover of project costs is to set a realistic goal, a realistic budget goal for a particular project. So technically, the carryover amount is already because we did not spend the obligated fund in fiscal year 22. That total amount of $2 million was already included in our unassigned reserve in fiscal year 22. Okay, so in fiscal year 23, when we're trying to spend the unspent fund of the 22, we are taking the money out from the unassigned reserve to complete the project. So this is what carryover works in each fiscal year. And for the city of Tacoma, we always have items that were not spent in the prior year, and we have to move those items from the prior year to the current year. So as I said, the best way to stop this trend of carryover year after year is to make sure that we have a very realistic goal of how much we can actually spend in 1 year. The next slide. This slide is actually a replica of slide number 6, which shows our financial performance from fiscal year 18 through 22. And in addition to those information, I included the prior slide information. That is the current budget. You can see that from fiscal year 18 to 22, they are the actual audited financial information. This fiscal year 23 is our current budget information. And the numbers of 27 million total revenue and 36.6 is actually from the prior slide, and it shows that our total deficit would be, if the number unchanged by the end of the year of fiscal year 23, it would be 4.5 million deficit. And just to let you know, our current unassigned fund balance is also around $4.6 million. So that means if we continue the trend of not trying to reduce our budget in fiscal year 23, our unassigned reserve would be depleted. Next slide, please.
So actually, before we go into the planning phase, it might be helpful because you just went through a lot of data. So I don't know if it would be helpful for us to kind of take a quick pause so that people can ask their questions around the data tables, or if we want to go through the options, because I know that you're going to do a lot of flipping of slides. So I don't know if, and I defer to how you all would like to proceed, but I know that I want to go back like a couple slides to start.
Yeah,
okay, so
I can start answering questions if you have any.
Yeah, and then we'll go through next steps.
And then, those are continuing, the next few slides is something that we suggest what we can do to improve our financial situation in the future.
Perfect. Can we go back to the slide with the bar chart that showed?
Yes, that one.
Mm-hmm.
So based on the 2022 bar, it looks like the combination of our unassigned, the net, I guess that's the orange, the net unassigned, which would be including those committed reserves, right? So it looks like that bar for 2022 goes up to almost $8 million.
Yes.
And so those committed, I guess the committed portion of that, right? Does that include our carryover? So the items that were in 2022 budget that are were carried over into 2023 that are paid for, and those monies from 2022 should have gone into the committed column, right?
Yes.
So those committed dollars are included in that 2022 bar. So that net does not include those dollars that should have been for that carryover. If you go to the next slide. So that $2,020,405, that should be reflected in the committed
In the
for
committed.
the 2022.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so my question is about, okay, so can we go to the next slide? So I just want to make sure. So when we're talking about the revenues.
The revenue is not reflected in this particular slide because it has not been changed. Because during the budget amendment, we did not have any budget revenue increase. The only change is in our expenditure.
Okay. And so this assumes, right? So how are the committed unassigned funds from the carryovers? Because again, I'm trying to think through this whole deficit or the difference between the revenues and, which makes sense, and what is actually accounted for already. But
Yeah.
it is accounted for in the prior fiscal year's committed reserve. So when you look at the ECFR, you see that we had, something like 7 million, or basically that full amount in our unassigned
7.8 or
reserve.
7.9 million, yeah.
Right. So I'm just trying to make sure, because in my mind, if I weren't just limiting this to programmatic revenues or tax revenues, but also considering what the actual level of the committed items in our reserve, unassigned reserve would be, I wouldn't necessarily say that 2 million contributes to a deficit, unless I'm, for this fiscal year, unless I'm misunderstanding, because that monies should be accounted for in our unassigned reserve as committed. So I guess that's the piece I'm not quite understanding.
I'd like to associate myself with the mayor's comment.
Of course, yes. You're right, Mayor. Actually, this $2 million, it's very difficult in one fiscal year when we are closing our financial, that we can segregate this part of money is supposed to come out from committed, this part of money is supposed to coming out from the unassigned. So when we close our financial year for fiscal year 23, all our expenditure and our revenue will be closed down. And if our actual expenditure is higher than the revenue, then it becomes the deficit. And we'll first go down to our unassigned reserve, okay? Let's say we have $4.5 million, okay? Nothing has been changed. We continue to maintain the same expenditure and no change was made. That $4.5 million will be close to the unassigned reserve. And we know that there are $2 million in the committed. So there will be a transfer from the committed to the unassigned to actually replenish the funds to represent that the $2 million is actually the committed money for the designated for the fiscal year. So this is how we do the closing for the year, because the funds transfer between reserve are done by transfer. The way to increase the reserve is we have more revenue than expenditure. And also we can transfer from other reserve to the unassigned in order to increase unassigned. So these are the only ways that we can increase or decrease the reserves.
Okay. So what I'm trying to make sure, and bear with me, because I'm trying to learn local budgeting. So it sounds to me that there is an order of operations when it comes to, like, when you learned in school, like you add first, and so the order of operations is such that first you say, all right, this is how much money we have, these are the items that we want to pay for in the budget.
Mm-hmm.
Then you say, okay, here are our primary sources of revenue: taxes, intergovernmental reimbursements, speed cameras, all that good stuff. Then you say, all right, even though we're in 2023 and some of these activities that are listed in the budget were things that we wanted to do in 2022, we still have to follow the rank order of paying for it. So first it is our revenues. Then, even though we only committed in the unassigned reserve in case we needed it, because we could have gotten some windfall, massive amount of money that we wouldn't necessarily have to tap those reserves for. So then, after you look at the revenues, then you figure out whether or not we need to tap an unassigned reserve, even though those monies in the prior fiscal year and those activities in the prior fiscal year could have and should have been paid for out of the general fund.
But
Okay.
it was not.
But it was not. Okay. All right. So, so now that I kind of got that piece together, I want to make sure that when we are talking about the deficit, right? And I thank you so much for walking us through it, because I do believe that there's a difference between budgetary deficits and
The actual.
actuals,
Yes.
right? So, you know, I agree with the point that was raised. We like to aim high in the budget, and it's not humanly possible, but it's important to note that we are taxing people based on our aspirations. But when we're looking at or thinking through this deficit, and I keep using question mark because I quotations, because I think that there's a lot that is just, this is just really done in a way that, quite frankly, if we're not careful, can be very misleading to people. The amount that we're talking about here, when, for the library in particular, I struggled going through the ACFR, I struggled going through the budget, because the bond money is in one place, but because we are starting construction, the expenditures are in another place. And that is kind of messing up, again, that order of operations. It makes things look really weird when we're talking about, it's particularly the capital outlays.
Yeah. So, Mayor, we have actually a lot of different reserve in the committed reserve. We do have an emergency reserve. We have an equipment replacement reserve. And we have a facility maintenance reserve, as well as a housing reserve. All these money together with the designated for the next fiscal year reserve is also in there. So it is my job to make sure that, for example, for the equipment replacement reserve, at the end of the year, I want to make sure that it is calculated correctly. Because at every fiscal year, the council, during the budget time, has designated a certain amount of money to replenish the unassigned reserve, the equipment replacement reserve. So how it works is, we have a prior year balance in our reserve, because all the reserve funds are in the balance sheet. So the money is carried over year after year after year. It's not like our expenditure and revenue and dividend, which is closed and cut down at June 30th. So it's my job to make sure that these reserve calculation is made properly. So first, with the equipment replacement reserve, I'm making an example. Let's say we have $3 million at our beginning balance in fiscal year 23, and the council at fiscal year 23 approved a contribution of reserve to equipment replacement. That money is, let's say, is $600,000, okay? $600,000. So 3 million plus 600 become 3,000,006. And then we need to look at the equipment replacement expenditure. We have an expenditure account that only relate to equipment replacement reserve. And that expenditure, I will tally up the total, how much we spent in fiscal year 23, and subtract from the $3.6 million. And that would be our ending balance of our equipment replacement reserve. And the same thing applied to housing reserve, the same thing that applied to the facility maintenance reserve, and the same thing will apply to this designated for the fiscal year reserve.
So for the library, is the library the amount of the adopted, the capital outlay? So like, while going through the budget, it appeared that as we were expending aspects of the bond, like as we were paying out, those appeared to be expenditures in the ACFR. Am I misunderstanding how that is calculated? So like, when we're looking at this capital outlays of 6.7 mil, right? In essence, we got the bond, we have these other grant funds, and we're using ARPA dollars to fund the library. But as we are paying contractors, where do the expenditures go in our budget?
So this $6.7 million is our total capital outlay. Only $5 million belongs to the budgeted amount of library expenditure, okay? So let's say the original balance of our bond reserve, the restricted bond reserve is $6 million, okay? And we budgeted for $5 million, okay? So let's say we spend all the $5 million, okay? So $6 million minus $5 million, we don't have any contribution in our bond reserve. So 6 million minus 5, our ending balance as of fiscal year 23 will be only $1 million. And this $1 million will be carried forward to fiscal year 24.
Okay.
And then eventually, when we make the payment for the library construction, this reserve will be totally depleted. And when we deplete this balance, this reserve, our next step is to look for other sources. Like we had assigned maybe $2.5 million in our special revenue fund for the library construction.
Right.
And we also assigned maybe about $4 million, and I'm sure which year that we're going to spend the $2 million, which year we're going to spend the other $2 million. But those money are going to be spent right after our bond reserve is completely depleted.
So, but the bond reserve is the bond reserve included in our unassigned, or I thought it was a separate reserve?
It is a separate reserve.
Okay, so that is where I am struggling in terms of the math not mathing. Because if I have $5 million that's earmarked for the library, for a construction project.
Yes.
But I got a bond reserve that's not counted here.
Yeah.
But the expenditures for the library is counted in the general fund.
Yeah.
Of course, we're not going to have enough revenues to cover that because it's sitting in a bond that we're paying over time.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be quiet because I think Councilmember Small is chomping at the bit and he's next in the queue. All right, go ahead, Councilmember Small.
I'm going to take off my mask for this part. I'd just like to begin by saying I am so sorry. That being said, like if you go through the just the generalized resources that are available to municipal people through like Maryland Municipal League, they'll give you a basic formula for how you do a budget or whatever. By way of full disclosure, since I was actually a city manager in Maryland for 3 3/4, which I call 4 years, I had to do this every year. There are legal requirements that are actually in the actual code of the state that are just also happen to be in our charter and whatnot. They're in there because they're required to be in all the charters so that they comply with the state laws. That being said, there are any number of ways officially to do a budget in Maryland. I forwarded to members of the council one of the PowerPoints that is outlines the general practice as Maryland Municipal League does it. You can find it if anybody is watching this and they're interested in knowing. But there are some things that are particular about it. Number one, you're supposed to be able to understand your spending versus your receivables. And if you do a budget, it is my understanding in the state of Maryland that your budget should technically balance year to year. And if it doesn't balance, then you have to inform everyone that it is not going to balance and that you're going to move monies from the reserve to cover the expenditures for the year. There's a thing that keeps getting said in here that is just bothering me, and I don't mean to have it bother me. And again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on your effectiveness in your job or anything like that. The carryover that you guys are talking about back and forth doesn't exist in Maryland. Officially, if you don't spend money, it is to go back into your general fund, and it's to be either automatically executed or officially turned back into your general fund. That doesn't mean you don't have contracts to pay or anything like that, but those expenditures become a part of your presuppositions of what you have to owe for next year. And so even though that is like, I just don't regard that as semantics. I think it's very important. I think it's mechanically very important. Additionally, I don't know anybody, I've never seen a budget that put their bond issue up against the actual spending for the building as a one-to-one outlay, when in actuality, you're paying that money back. So it's a cost. You put that on your cost side. But other than that, it's because you're paying it at maybe 3% interest, and so it's sort of a part of the process in the repay. But ultimately, it's like that on purpose so you can budget for it. There's law, like I could. So, there are critical things about the way in which the numbers on here match up that are certainly consistent with accounting principles and procedures. But when the mayor says the math ain't mathing, I am going to allege very specifically that there's a lot of things about the way this budget is constructed or the way in which you show revenues versus outlays or expenditures that don't show you whether or not you are actually on track to do your spending or indicate any manner by which you could tell whether or not someone has fulfilled their obligations on a contract, whether that contract carries over from year to year or anything like that. I looked in the budget overall analysis for the town, because you have to do one of those as another requirement of a budget that says what your outlines are for the year and stuff like that. I can't find it in there. Now, we used to have weird budgets, and I'd look at the budget when I was going to work the other place. I'd look at it and I'd be like, man, this is weird. And I don't understand why it is even like that, let alone the fact that any of the discussions about the constant yield rate that we could or should be having. My difficulty with this is that I've done this before. I've seen other people do this. I've seen other people's budgets with more than either the budget that I was familiar with or this one. And they don't show things this way. And as such, you can figure out where you are. I've known of practices where you get the receivables versus expenditures every month. My own personal difficulties with this center around the fact that there was no other staff for me to put these things together. So I know all of these rules, and this is not a good way to do this. And I've been waiting for it to be a better, for me to understand fully how these things are being shown so that I could be like, oh, it's so sophisticated. But it's really not. It's just I get how it works, but I also get you don't have to show any of this way. You could show it completely differently, and candidly, you could show this on QuickBooks and it would make more sense to the average person. And so I don't know what to do here, because we could begin at the beginning. We could begin at where I don't know what to do here, but I would like to say explicitly that I don't find any fault in you. I got real questions about the way in which you think a budget ought to be done in Maryland, given what the finite nature of the actual outlays and expenditures are. I don't understand. There's just a lot of this that I don't get, and I don't want to be unduly provocative, but there are so many questions about this, like why you would choose, why it would be chosen to do it this way, why anybody else, if reviewing or going through the budget process, like, because I used to talk to other people and we show each other our stuff and whatever else. Like, I apologize. But at the end of the day, there are some substantive things about where things are shown when you do a budget versus credits and debits that are just fundamental. Then you go to generally accepted accounting principles. Then you go to generally accepted government organizational principles. But as you go up the line, it's supposed to make sense. I don't think the way you show reserves makes sense. I don't think the way in which the presupposition of what's necessary to carry over for the town and the explicit nature of not only the suggestion, but basically the compliance that you have to have 2 months should be as a separate reserve. Like I don't get it. I'm not trying to be a jerk to anyone who is professionally inclined with regard to these things. I didn't mean to get these sort of professional skills because I was an attorney before I did all of this. I didn't necessarily even like accounting. But I can tell you, when people are yelling at you because you have to balance a budget and the things that bring in money are finite, among the things that you don't do is, you don't necessarily plan a lot against revenue. There's a lot of things about the way the money in here is shown that I just don't understand, and I would just like to say that it's going to be a difficult budget process for everyone to get me to understand why we do it this way. And I don't know what else to say about it. I've tried to think about what the value would be in showing it this way. I could go through this. It would take me ages, and I'm not trying to monopolize all this conversation, but this is strange.
Councilmember Small, we do have a long list of lights. Thank you so much. Councilmember DeBala.
Yes, thank you. I have some questions about the earlier slides in terms of comparing the presentation you did last year to this year, comparing 22 to 23. But I think maybe we should skip over that and help me to understand if the way that you have accounted for the closing of fiscal 22, the money that then we voted on an amendment to, we called it carryover, but to take the money that didn't get spent in fiscal 22 and apply it to fiscal 23. So if I understand it correctly, this is the first year that we've done it this way, where we we worked from the minimum, from the recommended 17%, and then what was extra, yes, so we did it differently than we've done it before for the first time. Yeah? No.
Yeah,
I'm going to
this-
get a yes on this side and a no on this side.
Yes, this is a recommendation by our new auditor,
Right.
Barbara King Thornton.
Right.
So they actually want us to make sure that there is, well, we actually show it on the same bar graph, but then there are the orange area
Right,
as
right,
well
the
as the
orange and the
yellow
yellow.
area.
Yeah.
The orange area represent our unassigned reserve, and the yellow area is the committed reserve. And both reserve are actually the funds can be moved around by the council. The council has authority to make the full use of the fund. And all the budget amendment and also the adopted budget, we actually put it through in front of the council, and the council actually approved those in fiscal year '23, the first budget amendment and the second budget amendment, they were all approved by the council.
Yes. So my question, if we did it differently in this year, in this past year, so then in the fiscal '23 first amendment, instead of moving money from fiscal '22 to '23, we were literally adding $2 million more in expenses.
Yes,
Okay.
because we already have available fund in the committee reserve
But the
to
money was
cover for
supposed-
that $2 million.
Right, but there was a change in the fiscal '22 accounting so that the money wasn't in the reserve. We were down to the 17, down to the 7
Yeah,
million.
in '22, everything was included in the unassigned. It was not separate.
Okay. Because so then my other two questions are, there's two other big chunks of money that I'm not sure how much of them are in this table or not. The mayor brought up the question about the library money. I'm going to bring the ARPA money. Some of this is general fund money, some of it isn't, some of it is in here, some of it isn't. All of these questions are leading me to say this -4 million that is suddenly so much bigger than it's ever been before. How much of that has to do with these two newish big pots of money that we didn't used to have to keep track of? And suddenly we are, but it's just not clear to me that how does the ARPA money play into this table? We talked about how the library money plays into
This
this
is
table.
actually general fund.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned in the prior slide, in the, I don't remember which particular slide, we actually show the council that we have 5 different funds.
Right.
General fund is the one that we are talking about today.
Right.
With all the deficits and,
Okay.
budget deficit and also the actual deficit. The other funds, the ARPA fund is a separate fund.
Okay,
So far, in special revenue fund, in speed camera fund, in stormwater fund, and also in ARPA fund, we have no deficit.
okay,
And
so,
also, they don't have reserve. They only have fund balance. So that's the difference between the funds, the different funds,
Right.
purpose funds, and also the general fund.
Right, so
General
if-
fund, we have so many different reserve for different purposes. And we have the housing fund that was actually separated, and it become one of the committee reserve. And that was just created maybe a few years ago. And the ERR was there all the time. And we have the emergency reserve, and we do have the facility maintenance reserve. And all these reserve can be funded only from the unassigned reserve.
right, and
In
so
order,
if,
in order to replenish all these reserve, the money has to come from the unassigned.
so I don't know if it's a question or a point. If we're talking about the fiscal health of the city, and we are only talking about one fund, granted the biggest fund, but it's only one of the funds, and the ARPA fund's not small. The bond money for the library is not small. They're not as large as the general fund, but they're not pocket change either. Does this give us a misleading picture of our city finances? To talk
Because,
only about this one fund?
yeah, because the general fund is our operating fund. So we put our emphasis on the general fund, and that is the fund that we have all the personnel costs, all those operating costs. We have the debt service. Debt service is the account that we pay for the bond. We have to make the bond payment every year, 2 times.
Right.
To pay the infrastructure bond and also the community bond of 2015. And we had just pay off the public works bond. So right now, we have only 3 bonds outstanding. And this debt service is part of the expenditure why that we had increased expenditure, because we have to pay these bonds every single year for 2 times. So beginning 2018, after we had this library bond as well as the transportation bond, there are increased expenditures from 2018 because of the bond debt service. We call it debt service. While the bond reserve, I would have to say, it is only for payment of the vendors who actually help us to do the construction work for the library.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? If that is the case, then are the expenditures for the library included in the general fund?
Yes.
Okay, so now I'm really confused, right? Because if the expenditures for the library are included in the general fund, but the bond, which is basically the monies, like the loan, right? I'm talking about my mortgage, right? I have this big pocket of money somewhere that I'm making a payment on to the bank, but technically I have the money that I need to pay my people off. If I take some home improvement loan, for example, I know you hate it when I make these kinds of analogies because it's not the same, and please forgive me, Director Chung, because I do it all the time, and that's the best way I can understand what's happening. I've taken a home improvement loan out, $100,000. I need to get a new kitchen, and my floors are awful. So I am making payments, monthly payments on that loan, but I have this bucket of money that I can now use to pay my vendors. So my question is, where is the payments that I have to make? And you're saying that's debt service. The bucket of money that I have for this library, and you're saying that's in the bond reserve. But the expenditures that I'm having to shell out to pay these contractors is actually in the general fund.
Yeah. So the structure of the general fund is, first we have the personnel expenditure, then we have the supplies, and then we have the contract costs, and this is in the departmental budget accounts. And then after the departmental budget accounts, we have the debt service. The debt service is part of our annual expenditure or biannual expenditure. We have to have it to pay every single 6 months. Every 6 months and this is what you say, the construction loan. Okay, we pay our construction loan, including the principal and interest from the debt service, and this debt service account is in our 8,000 account in the general fund. And then coming down from the debt service is our CIP money. CIP money is where we have our equipment replacement expenditure, capital expenditure, library construction expenditure, road expenditure, street improvement expenditure. All these are related to capital improvement, and these are expenditures. So when we're talking about equipment replacement reserve, the example that I showed to you is, first we have the initial balance in fiscal year 23. We add the amount that the council approved to replenish, and that's a contribution to our reserve in the equipment replacement reserve, and that add to the initial balance, okay? And we had to look into our equipment replacement expenditure account, and that part of money, the expended amount, is tally up and need to be subtracted from the equipment replacement reserve to come to the ending balance of the equipment reserve in fiscal year 23. It is a very complicated process, but this is the part of the year-end closing that I have to do.
Yeah, so I guess, and I'll turn, I'm so sorry, Councilmember DeBala. I guess, again, where I'm getting confused is that for some of our other funds, right, so the ARPA fund, we have a set amount of money, we have a set number of projects that are going through with those monies, and they're separate. But it seems as if with the library, instead of having the expenditures where we're paying the contractors in a separate bucket with the bond fund dollars, we are in essence claiming the expenditures as part of our budget which would mean that we are taxing residents on the expenditures as well as the bond amount. I guess I'm just trying to make sure that we're not in some weird way double counting and showing an expenditure, because the expenditures are in the general fund, against the revenues, but the actual monies for those expenditures is in this bond fund that is off to the side. So we're counting the expenditures and the debt, but the money that is supposed to be used to pay those contractors is sitting somewhere else. And I think that's the piece that I'm getting confused about, because with the ARPA, it's clean. We have the ARPA dollars, we have a separate budget, it's a separate fund. With stormwater, it's clean. You have a separate budget, it's off to the side. But with the library bond, it feels like the funds for paying people, it's separate from where the expenditures are, which is in the general fund, which in my mind inflates our expenditures, which means it looks as if we're always going to be at a deficit. Because right now, we're paying for the library. Right now, for the next 3 years, according to this framework, in the next 3 years, we're going to be in a deficit. Why? Because we're paying contractors for the library construction. And all of those costs are being accounted for in the general fund. So if we're not accounting for all of these, for the bond itself, and we're not considering that as part of something that, we're doing a new street paving project or something, then we're going to show in the red, unless we come up with $5 million or however much money, the library costs, because we're not taking out the fact that the bond money is sitting there. Does that make sense? It seems to me that it's misleading to just show the general fund with those capital outlays when you can't account for the bond because it's in a separate account.
Yeah, it is confusing, but in our small city accounting structure, we have to, if you want to be very clear, we could have set up a special bond construction account, facility account, purely for the bond construction, but we did not set it up because that was the debt service part that was always being in our general fund.
Right, and that makes sense because we're paying on it,
Yeah,
right? That's
paying
the
on it.
loan I have to pay every
Yeah,
month. That's
yeah.
part of my budget.
Yeah.
But the actual monies that I got to pay these contractors seems like that should have been in a separate fund. And if we went over for one reason or another, and we need to tap into the contingency, I thought one of the reasons why we had the ARPA set aside monies for the library was that's the contingency money, right? So if we're paying these contractors and then, something happened, we have to tap into the contingency. The contingency is in the ARPA money. So again, this is not trying to make things more complicated than they already are. But the library project in and of itself is split across multiple funds.
It is, and most of the fund is being drawn from the bond fund because we want to make sure that we actually depleted the bond fund before we actually go into the other subsidiary source of reserves. So yes, it is confusing, but this is the way we have been doing because we are a small city, and then our fund structure can only be created in so many different funds. And we already have 5 different fund accounts. So it will be structurally very difficult to keep track if we create more and more accounts to complete different projects. So in a way, like the street project, the sidewalk project, if you want to be clear, we have to create different funds for those different projects. But historically, since we are a small city, it has been always been put into the general fund under the capital improvement accounts.
So I'm going to turn it, because I just sidetracked Councilmember DeBala, but I will have another question kind of separately, but I want to turn things back over to Councilmember DeBala.
Thank you. I had 3 more questions. I'm not sure if I can remember what they were. No, it's complicated. So, but to follow up on what you just said, so in the general fund, is there a revenue source that is taking out money out of the bond fund?
The revenue source, The bond proceed, as I mentioned in one of the 10-year slide, we actually received that in fiscal year '23. It's not called revenue. It's called other financial sources. It's not part of the revenue, but the total bond receive, the receipt, the proceed, it actually go to the bond reserve. We hold the fund there to make sure that we have sufficient money to pay for the vendors for the library construction.
And then as you spend it out of the general fund, so it's an expense in the general fund.
It expand in the general fund, and it first will go to the unassigned reserve. And as I mentioned, we are going to transfer from the bond reserve to replenish the unassigned reserve.
Right.
This is how it works in accounting. The different reserves are always replenished by the unassigned reserve with the contribution.
Okay, so I wanted to, rather than continue this discussion right now, I wanted to ask about two other things. So I remember some of the discussion about the first budget amendment for '23. I didn't bring my notes, but I do remember some of it now that I'm looking at the details here. But my question for the city manager, I don't remember hearing, maybe I just don't remember, what your plan was if we were increasing the expenditures by $2 million, which was the net effect of the budget amendment, if I understood correctly. So for example, we're going from 6.7 million on the library to adding another 1.19 million on the library for the budget amendment. So anyway, never mind the example. What were you about to say? I'm sorry.
I was going to say, thank you, Councilmember Dabala. When we had the conversation and we got to the end of the fiscal year, and it was projects that departments had not been able to get to and finish, and there was contractors, there was projects that were ongoing that we needed to carry over into this year to commence and try to finish some of those. Some projects, particularly as it relates to Public Works, there were equipment purchases that we had under, not necessarily under contract, but we was in discussion with that we just could not have everything paid out. And so a lot of these projects, it was our intention to have those completed by now, but when inflation and everything else happened, costs have went up, and trying to complete other projects had kind of changed our plan for a lot of these projects, even still this year.
Right, and my question was, the net effect of that First Amendment was to, if I understand it, was to increase the fiscal '23 expenditures, adopted expenditures by $2 million. What was your thinking at that time about having that much more expenditure in the '23 column? I don't remember. I just literally just don't remember what the discussion was about that increase. Looks like somebody else is circulating it.
The budget increases 142,877 to the general fund.
So, okay, but this says, so, well, that would be why I don't remember it, because it says something different here in July. Okay, so I'll just read it, and then that won't be a question, because here's the information. So the July 2022 cover sheet says that the carryover, the so-called carryover, because we know it's not really carrying over, the carryover amount for the department budget and for the capital improvement projects is $2.020 million, and the budget increase is $142,877 in the general fund. But here it says that the budget amendment the increase is 2.02, so I'm back to being confused. So that's, I guess that's not a question, that's just a statement that we need to, I think we need to get back to.
Unfortunately, I did not bring the
I
entire
didn't bring it either.
first budget amendment over, but I actually have the general fund budget amendment of the first budget amendment. And those numbers I actually retrieved from the cover sheet of the July budget amendment. So if you look at the page 2 of the budget amendment, if you have that copy, the general fund subtotal was $2,163,282.19, and that is the total of the $2,020,405 plus the $142,000.
But I think one thing that came up a lot during that first budget amendment, a number of council members, including, I know for a fact, Councilmember Costick had comments, as well as Mayor Stewart and myself, and we were very adamant about making sure that that budget amendment clearly stated what was a carryover that would not have necessarily budget implications, meaning those dollars would go into, as we were told at the time, they would basically go into the unassigned reserve, and that's what they would be, those dollars to be used to pay for those activities. And that the only net increase in terms of the budget increase, because we were just moving stuff between, even though you can't move stuff, you have to put it in the unassigned reserve, and then you count it as an expenditure in the next fiscal year. The only increase that came through for the general fund was that $142,000.
That is correct.
So at the time, the understanding was that, yes, the expenditures for '23 were going to go up by that $2 million. But the revenues, or I'm sorry, the funds for those projects should have been accounted for in our unassigned reserve. So it was presented more or less like a wash, and that in essence, you were going to only end up with an increase of the 142, because we should have already accounted for the $2 million as part of the '22 budget.
Yes, and that's exactly correct. And as I mentioned, that $2 million is included in the committed reserve of $3.3 million, and we have sufficient fund to pay for that carryover amount.
Okay, and then in that case, I am not understanding why this says there's a deficiency of $4.5 million, which includes the $2 million that I think you just said we have money to cover.
So like I just said, the closing of the year is, first of all, we have to find out what is our total expenditure and what is our total revenue.
Right.
And we need to find out the net amount, and that total net amount, if it is in a deficit amount, it will first go to the unassigned reserve. And then the money that we are designated for the $2 million, which is from the committed reserve, will be transferred from the committed reserve to replenish the unassigned reserve. It is a complicated process, but this is the way that we have been doing for this different reserves, just like equipment replacement, facility maintenance reserve, and also housing reserve. So this is the way that we have been doing, is by transferring between the reserve accounts.
And so when does that take place? Quarterly?
It will be done at the end of the year.
Okay, so then,
So right now, we are just projecting that we are going to spend we're going to spend $36.5 million, but that may not be the actual fiscal year expenditure for 2023. Because this is still in the budget process. This is still a plan that we're going to spend this money. And the actual expenditure has not solidified yet.
so I think this is my last question. I apologize for taking so long. I was going to say, the sooner we get the second quarter financials, the better, and plus with an explanation, because if I look at the first quarter without an explanation, the one that was sent to us in December, there's some pretty big numbers that I figured out what they were, but when you first look at them, they're like, oh my God, you're really scary big numbers that appear to raise. So I would like to see two things. I was going to say, could we please get the fiscal year second quarter report as soon as possible? And now I'm also wondering if we need some projections for the rest of the year. You must have them if you're thinking about the reductions that you mentioned last week for budget scenarios for this year. You must have some idea of what the projections are going to be for this year, or you wouldn't be asking for those proposed reductions. So I'd like to see that so that we can get a handle on this as a moving target, is what I'm hearing, that this is where we are now, halfway through the year, but that there are a whole bunch of other potential changes coming up. Some may make things, some may raise the end of the year deficit, some of them may shrink the end of the year deficit, but it's kind of hard to know without some set of projections, what you all are thinking about from now till the end of this year that leads you to want to ask for proposed budget reductions. So that's two things in one. Sorry about that. Two asks in
So,
one.
Councilmember, so what we based off is what we know right now, based on the way that the cash flow in the city is happening, based off of what Director Chung discussed this evening about kind of where we're tracking with the carryover situation, increases, and knowing that the last budget was adopted with a $2 million deficit built in it, and where we're tracking right now, forecasting $4.5 million to be able to try to end the year, is and try not to use a lot of the unassigned reserves as well, because we only have, like Director Chung stated, a little over $4.5 million left. And if we apply any deficit we have this year, that's just going to take away from the unassigned. So what we're trying to do is similar to what we did last year, which we were a little bit later last year in trying to freeze so we can hold some savings to take up some of the deficit that we did have. Because the deficit at this time last year, I want to say it was I can't remember, it was around 8 million, but it was significant at the time that we forecasted. And what we did last year, and Director Chung talked about it, and if staff can put up page 41
Of
what? Of the ACFR.
Oh, I have it right here.
I've got it right here. Excellent.
So
If I can finish.
got it right here.
As staff put that up, and when you look at 41, so what we knew last year going in, we had a deficit looking at 8.2 million starting out. There was 35 million that was originally appropriated for the budget. Outside of the $1.2 million that we got in ARPA, that was applied, and that helped us come to a surplus this year. But also, as I stated last year, staff, when we did some freezing last year of $3 million, that's how you get from 35 million to 32 million in the final appropriated. The variance, that's the favorable variance for the city, the 5.4, which went into unassigned, whereas projects we were not able to complete by the end of the fiscal year.
So
and essentially for this page, if we had not put in a freeze and used the savings to help our budget situation, there would not be a surplus. There should have been a higher deficit than having that 900-some thousand surplus. So coupled with not getting into some projects, the 1.2 million ARPA, and then that $3 million reduction that staff went through is what helped us get to ending the year in a surplus.
So one point, you told us last week that the hiring freeze just went into effect the prior week. So how long has the hiring freeze been in effect in order for there to be some sort of impact that we see based on the actuals for 2022?
So for 2022, so what I talked about last week is the current budget, fiscal year 23. So we're looking at the last 6 months of the fiscal year, which you'll see at the end of the year when the ACFR is presented to you. So for last year, we put it in around the same time last year is what helped us yield that amount of money.
Okay, okay, I don't believe that. So I want to make sure that we are all speaking the same language.
I haven't had a chance yet.
I'm sorry.
Can we have like a recess or something? Because I can't.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that we're speaking the same language, because what we are looking at is the original versus the final appropriated budget versus our actuals, right? So our actuals are not showing a deficit. Now, we could debate on what happened to get to that point. I would argue that we consistently as a city budget high. I mean, there's typically, every year I've been on council, we've had conversations around carryover. So I'm not surprised that our appropriated budget and the final appropriated budget are high, like we start high, the original, what the city manager proposes is always high. The council comes in and what's finally approved is lower than that because we're trying to get the tax rate down. Then when the rubber meets the road on what folks are actually able to do, that's what you see in the actuals. And we're never able to do what is all of the things that are included in that approved budget. And that is what you see in this column, and that is what you see in this variance. I mean, it's the tale as old as time, at least the 5 years I've been on council. So that to me is not necessarily the same as our city is operating, so to speak, in a financial hole.
Which is untrue.
You know, so would we like to maybe have more money in the bank? I need to have more money in the bank. I think we all could stand to save a little more. But it doesn't mean that we're necessarily operating in the hole. And so I think that maybe it's just semantics. Maybe it is just, you know, trying to make sure that people understand. But it is a fundamental difference in saying we budget high and spend low, and versus we are operating in a deficit. So I want to make that point painfully clear, because I think that there could easily be a lot of misinformation that goes out to the community that can really startle people. And I want to make sure, like this spreadsheet that is here, that $2 million was accounted for in the unassigned reserve. Because of our wonky system, which we're hoping to improve upon, we are showing higher expenditures because we are spending money on the library. We have the money for those expenditures for the contractors. They're just sitting in another account that we can't show here. So I think it's important to make those things painfully clear to people. Otherwise, it appears as if our community is operating $5 million in debt. And that's just not true. I'm so sorry, Councilmember Siemens. It is your turn to have
Yeah,
the floor.
you're just saying that, aren't you?
I promise.
First of all, when early in this meeting, the mayor said she was glad that she was going last with the council comments, because most people have probably said what she was going to say. I'm disappointed to be going so late in the comments tonight, because I think my constituents are probably all asleep by now, as we should be. Are we going to go past 10
Oh,
o'clock?
I didn't even realize the time. This is a good one. Okay.
So what's the council's pleasure on that? Are we going to go beyond?
Thank you so much, Councilmember Siemens, for reminding me of protocol. Are members of council okay with us proceeding this discussion past 10 p.m.?
Yes.
All right.
I appreciate that.
I would like to take a break. I do have a chronic illness, and I get twitchy when I have to sit still, and my stress level increases. So if we could walk around for a second or whatever, that would be groovy.
We can,
No, we go ahead and do that for 5 minutes?
yep. So we will
And we'll start at
reconvene.
5 minutes.
With
if
5
every-
minutes.
If everybody's back or not.
Or
10:10.
you can feel free to start without me.
All right, we're back?
We're back.
Okay. I thank you for the suggestion of a break.
I appreciate that.
Okay, you know, I've been on the council for a lot of years, and I think my constituents get confused with this as I've gotten confused with it throughout the years. But I think the best thing to do from my perspective is to boil it down to kind of some simple terms. And one of the terms that's used around the city budget here is a deficit. And that you know, means one thing to me, and maybe it means something else to Ms. Chung and to the city manager. I would like to follow the mayor's lead in kind of doing a little analogy, right? And so the way I look at the budget is, you know, like what I would do at home, right? And it's, I've got so much income for the year, and I have so many expenses for the year. And at the end of the year, I can look at that and say, well, did I make more money than I spent? In which case I had a surplus. And did I make less money than I spent? I'd blame my wife, but I'm not allowed to do that. Right? Then I would call it a deficit, but let's not call it that anymore because it's too confusing. Let's just call it not enough money, right? And so when I do that, though, I can't just say, well, there's how much money I have coming in this year, because sometimes we'll have a bigger expense during the year, and so we might have to draw some money out of our savings account to use. And so when I get to the end of the year and I look at it and say, well, I didn't make enough money to pay for everything that I bought this year, but I had money in the bank that I used to help pay for that, you know? So again, I don't see that as being a bad problem. Actually, I look at it and say, hey, that's good. We're good examples for our kids that when we had to buy that car, I could pay for some of the car with the money I earned, but I pay for the rest of it with money I had in the bank. Maybe that's an extreme example. I might not do that with a car, but a refrigerator I might. Okay? But then I look at that and I say, okay, there's these different terms, reserved and unreserved and all that. Well, I've got a couple of bank accounts where savings accounts, and some of that money is earmarked, and that money I don't want to use ever. I don't want to get into that, and that would be what the city would call a reserved fund, right? And the other bank account, though, is money that's there in case. It's an emergency. Well, I realize the bank's got, the city has some of these unassigned or unreserved funds that they do still have a purpose. And so they are kind of restricted, but only restricted because we're good, honest people and don't use it unless we really have to. But anyways, the bottom line is it still get to the end of the year. Did I make enough money to pay for my expenses? And if not, did I have money in the bank account that was one that I would feel comfortable using? And if that's the case, I don't have what somebody might call a deficit. Don't have a shortage. I've done a good job. And so my question to our account is, did we budget for this current fiscal year, did we budget to spend more money than we had in revenues plus unrestricted reserves?
Yes, we did. This is our fund summary for the general fund for fiscal. I'm looking at the fund summary of adopted 23, and I'm looking at our total revenue during the adopted budget was 27 million. Okay, our total expenditure was $34 million. So if you're talking about deficit, we're comparing the number of the revenue and to the number of the expenditure. When your expenditure amount, 34 million, is higher than your actual revenue received, 27 million.
Revenue plus reserves,
We,
plus the unrestricted reserves.
revenue is revenue. Revenue and expenditure are in the income statement account, and they closed out every year. Reserve is in our balance sheet, and this is an account that we can carry forward year after year.
It's money
Similar, just like you mentioned about your analogy, is the savings account. Our reserve is our savings account.
Right.
And your checking account, which you just said, that is running low, and you have to get the money out from the savings account. When you get the money out to replenish your checking account, that particular part of money is called deficit amount that you're drawing from your savings, which we are doing that to our unassigned reserve.
And so my question was, did we have budgeted to spend more money than what we had in income plus the unrestricted reserve?
We don't include the unrestricted
I
reserve.
know you don't. I'm asking, that's not the question. I'm asking not how you do the accounting. I'm saying, did we have more expenses than we had in revenue plus unassigned reserves, which is like the savings account?
The fund summary that I'm just talking about is just comparing the revenue to
I
the
know that,
expenditure.
that's not my question, but it's okay. The answer is, we did not budget to spend more money than we had, right? We had it in revenue plus unassigned reserves. That's money that the previous councils had put away to a savings account, and then we decided to spend some of that last year. And so it's not, in city speak, it may be a deficit, but in reality, it is not spending more than we had.
I think the presentation today that I have done is mainly comparing the revenue to the expenditure. We're not including the unassigned reserve in the calculation of whether we have deficit or surplus.
I rest my case, thank you.
Thank you.
And I just want to piggyback off of Councilmember Seaman's point. It would be extremely helpful to know what proportion of the 2023 expenditures should have been, with the table that we're looking at right now, included, and you show the carryovers, the 2 million, and what aspect of that is counted under the committed reserve, which is showing for 2022, we had 9 million in the committed reserve bucket. If what we see here is correct, I'm not exactly sure of what our committed reserve totals are for 2023, and whether or not certain items have already been expended. But what items that are in the expenditures for 2023 should have been accounted for under not the unassigned, because we need to leave the unassigned reserves alone, but the committed reserve. And then what aspects of the library construction costs, because we're not able to keep a separate library fund kind of account, what aspects of that 36 million is actually covered under the bond reserve?
$5 million.
5 million. So if we're talking about 30, so you could take off $5 million off the top, that then puts us at 31, and then you take away that 2 million that should have been covered under the committed reserve, then there's your deficit. So it's not a deficit. It's just the funds are available, but they're covered in other places. Now, again, we can have a separate conversation about how we need to talk about budgeting and what's the right shipping in terms of the 2024 budget. But what I am concerned about is how we are presenting these 2023 account numbers in a way to kind of skew the discussion around the 2024. Because I think that there's, just simply because of the accounting systems, the ways in which things are counted and have to be counted, I don't want to repeat myself, but that is misleading. So that 4.5 is accounted for through the $5 million that's in the bond reserve based on the construction contracts we've signed off on for the library, and the 2 million that was carried over that should have been in the committed reserve. Let's see, Councilmember Small.
I have a series of questions. It's okay if either the esteemed accountant or the city manager can't answer them, but I do think they're relevant. The first one would be, are we currently on track with regard to disbursements from the county concerning the tax revenue that is a component part of the general fund?
We are keeping track of our revenue from the county every single month. And we have a track record, how much we receive every month, and it shows up in our property tax revenue and personal property tax revenue. And this is all included in our financial system. And we have special accounts set up for each type of revenue.
So it is possible under your current system to expect that there are hard monies that are the component parts of this budget from year to year.
Yes, and that is the actual revenue that we are receiving.
Yes. And that revenue primarily being derived from tax revenue.
If we are talking about property tax, yes.
What would you regard as personal property taxes? Would you also regard that as the same sort of tax?
This is regarded as a tax revenue, yes.
Okay. So, notwithstanding the fact that you can have a hard expectation of what your actual tax burden could potentially be year to year in Maryland through the constant yield rate, and if there are no adjustments to the constant yield rate, then you know how much money you are going to be budgeting against with regard to tax burdens, at least for real property taxes. And so with regard to personal property taxes, as those things are derived by any number of other things, components in the actual business process. And so sometimes they're more and sometimes they're less. You could do some economic forecasting with regard to that, but basically, unless you are losing substantive businesses, you could theoretically plan a budget that includes not only your revenues from the hard money associated with the constant yield rate or whatever the total is that you were going to charge everyone, in addition to what you could reasonably assume in an economic cycle if things were the same. In theory, you could even budget those things with regard to inflation if you wanted to, as a component part of planning. Those things being true, I do not understand how it would be possible that we would be looking at these numbers without an expectation that we are currently going to meet the basic set of circumstances associated with tax revenue and the hard costs of a municipality. After you do that, if you have aspirations, then often you use your savings or reserve funds or whatever else to balance the budget when you approve it. So in theory, my understanding has always been, even though it is not a formal declaration from the state of Maryland that you have to balance a budget, you can theoretically be certain that your budget is balanced when you pass it. Is that true?
It actually depends on what was the adopted budget amount in expenditure and revenue.
Okay,
And in the
so-
case of fiscal year '23, it is obviously we are not balanced.
All right, so when you were saying we are not balanced, are you saying that with regard to the expectation that there were reserve funds put into this budget so that it would be even, if you're not considering that balanced?
When we are talking about a balanced budget, we're simply looking at the income statement, the revenue versus the expenditure. When you're talking about reserve, we're talking about the permanent account of reserve account, which is different from the income statement.
I am glad that you said that, because that was going to be the point that I was going to make next. If we are talking about the general fund outlook and the current budget, but we are expecting that we are going to have our hard dollars as a part of this budget, but we don't know whether or not those hard dollars are coming in at the appropriate level and with regard to their natural infusion into the budget. I could see how maybe you would show some sort of year-to-date deficit with regard to actuals, because you don't theoretically have the money. And we're not borrowing against our presupposed amounts in order to increase our money or operate with reserves in the way that a business would, because we have hard money. So my curiosity here is why we would be talking so much about the reserve funds when the reserve funds are mechanically not necessarily a part of the operating budget for any given year, unless you have some sort of vote which says we are going to use X amount of funds. Then, usually about 6 months in, you do a budget readjustment and you're like, well, look, some of this stuff costs more. There were some exigent circumstances. We need to move X amount of money. We may not be able to spend this money, so we're going to move this money from that money. And the reason why you can't see that in this budget is there are no line items by which you could evaluate where you would potentially move money in a budget to keep it even before you even got to thinking about reserves. I do not know why the city of Tacoma Park chooses to do things this way, but with regard to the efficiency of the current operating budget that you are using, if you are alleging that you have cost savings, I would argue specifically that that is fatuous and absurd, because the nature of the budget is to balance itself with regard to the expenditures that are necessary to operate a town. In the event that you do not do those things, maybe staffing issues, maybe contracts issues, those funds usually are informed by a reality that the person who is in charge of the budget will say, we're not going to get to X. Therefore, we should move X money into Y. And therefore, we are operating within the confines of the budget that we have passed without going into the reserves. And so if we were having that conversation and we were talking about, well, since we did X, or since we're not doing X, we got Y, and so we can move some of these things around, that would be fine with me. But the presupposition that labor expenses or employment expenses or capital outlays or any things that you can budget for against hard dollars would be considered as something other than the operating budget means that all of this, in my mind, is to some degree superfluous. And I know that my mind is probably slightly more frustrated than the average person. I know I may have some skills or whatever else with regard to this. But at the end of the day, there are profound things about budgets that are being alleged in here that are flawed or explicitly wrong. And I don't blame anyone for the prospect of being able to balance a budget with regard to actuarial norms. And I wouldn't even begrudge anybody the ability to get an award for such a budget. But that does not mean that there are line items where someone could say, well, look, we are not making the proper expenditures with regard to this process, and I don't understand why. Where's the efficiency here? Or, well, we know how much it costs to pay for health care and the employees for a year. We know that we have a performance-based system, and we had an anticipatory thing, or maybe we're going to do 2, 3, or 4%. Those numbers should be in here. Those should be a part of the way we're talking about these things. I am currently completely appalled. And I don't think it's any staff person's fault. But this is in no way reflective of even the norms that they inculcate you with if you happen to not be properly inculcated by your town on budgets. This isn't even necessarily in compliance with any of the like we haven't even talked about the fact that in theory, you got issues with regard to the constant yield rate and the way you talk about it. We even talked about the fact that carrying over is illegal with regard to the language that you use with regard to budgets. They make big deals about this stuff in Maryland. In theory, somebody could come over here and be like, what are you even doing? And so I am frustrated. And I'm frustrated because all of these things and these confusions relate back to other sorts of things about process and rules that are messed up. And I don't mean to sit here and look crazy. I like process. I know all of these rules. It's not that hard to make this shit look right. Or I apologize. I did not mean to curse on the record. I apologize.
Yeah. Councilmember Small, if we could.
Thank you. I apologize.
Thank you.
I don't mean to be so worked up. But the effective administration of government is not hard. All you have to do is presuppose that sunshine is going to be required and that you need to be able to be accountable to both someone who has wild aspects of experience and philosophical disquiet with larger philosophical constructs that are allegedly being applied, or somebody who's brand new and has never done a budget before, because that's citizenship. And they need to be able to understand it. And this is not understandable. The fact that we're even looking at this doesn't make any sense if we're talking about budgets and outlooks. And that's all I have to say.
All right, thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments? Okay. Councilmember Siemens?
Thank you. Maybe I'm premature. Maybe I should wait till after the planning section section is going to be discussed.
Yep. Okay. All right. So first, I just want to say again, thank you so much, Director Chung, for walking us through this information. It's been really helpful. And I just want to stress how appreciative we are to all of the hard work that you've put in year after year after year. And every year you come in with us, I can't stress enough. I can always tell you're smiling, even though you have a mask on, and your patience with walking us through this every time. It's just, I'm so appreciative.
I enjoy my work, and I like to do these numbers, and I don't mind, explaining what I'm doing. So I thoroughly like what I'm doing. So especially with a small city, and everybody know each other. So this is why I like working with my team, the deputy city manager, and everyone that in the finance department and other departments. So maybe this presentation is not what you expected, but I'm just providing you the exact number that is shown in the adopted budget throughout the last 10 years, and as compared to the actual financial statement number, and the actual financial statement number are audited by the auditor. So if there are any error or, rules and regulations that we are not in compliance with, it will be caught. It should be caught by the auditor, and every year we have an unmodified opinion from the auditor. So I'm just using those hard numbers from the financial statement and also the hard numbers in the budget book. I'm not inventing this number. It might look confusing, but it is what it is.
That's the thing about numbers, they are what they are.
It's not invented by me. And during these presentation process, I always want to put the footnotes in there, showing that where I got those numbers from. For example, page 41 is where we can actually compare the original budget to the final budget to the actual budget. And I feel like that this is a very helpful financial statement that can tell us what our budget process is and what we have been doing throughout the year. From the adopted budget to the final budget, and at the end of the year, we have an actual financial statement. So this is a true revelation of what the city finance should be. So, but I'm sorry if this presentation is not up to your expectation and it's confusing.
No need to apologize at all. This is a new council, and I think the biggest thing that we're all learning together.
Yes.
There are a lot of questions. We're also learning the right way, the ways in which people like to have information presented. So you did an amazing job. Do not apologize at all. We appreciate you and the work that you've done. So I see Councilmember Siemens has his light.
Yes, when I said I didn't have to go, a few minutes ago, I was thinking there were more slides that we were going to go through tonight. But if we're not going to do that, then I would like to go ahead now.
Sure. I think given the hour, if Director Chung is okay with us closing the discussion.
Okay. In that case, I would like to say that with what I heard tonight, I think that we should lift the hiring freeze and go back to the budget as we prepared, the previous council prepared it for implementation. And so I would like to make a motion that we direct the city manager to remove the hiring freeze.
Do you have a second?
Second.
Okay. All those in favor of removal of the hiring freeze, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Opposed.
Any abstain? Okay, hiring freeze is lifted. Okay, I think that's no more lights. All right, thank you all.
I'm sorry. Are we, before we wrap up, the second part of the last part of the presentation is what are we going to do about these numbers? So we've been talking about the numbers. What are we going to do about these numbers? That's one thing. I did want to ask for more information on identifying new sources of ongoing revenue, because it's something that we have talked about with the previous council. It's something we talked about this time last year. We've got a number of ideas that I believe are listed on the whiteboard in the city manager's office. I'd like to know where we are with some of that and when we would be able to talk about adopting some of the things, some of the approaches that we've been discussing. Or let me rephrase that, when we can have in front of us a proposal to do some of these things so that we can talk about adopting them. Because in the presentation proper, there aren't specifics.
No.
So I would like to see specifics, and I'd like to know when we can see proposals, or alternatively, if we do them ourselves as council members and propose them ourselves?
I think that in terms of aspects of economic development, which was one of the items that was there, we will have a presentation from our housing and community development that included a explanation of the housing and economic strategic plan. There were a number of aspects of that plan that were designed to help to incentivize and concrete proposals that could help to increase development in our city, which is one of the items. I think the other item in terms of the tax rate are things that we will talk about as we enter into budget discussions. And then I believe the other item that was here was budget cuts. And I think to echo Councilmember Small, that is going to be critically important, particularly as we are talking about the 2024. I think that there were enough questions raised today about the accuracy of this deficit reporting that can cause one to question whether or not this is really that it is what it appears to be. But I think that those points around balancing the budget, the points that we talked about today, the fact that what is proposed to us is typically quite high, and then what we adopt is quite high, I think those are discussions that we need to have as part of the 2024 budget making process. The other aspect of balancing the budget and making sure that we're submitting a budget that ensures that our projected revenues match with our projected expenditures. Again, is something that I think is important for us to talk about as we enter into 2024 budget season. But again, the critical piece, and I will say from my own personal experience dealing with our budget, is without line items, it is very hard to do. It is very difficult to make any meaningful cuts or suggestions to the budget if you don't have line items that kind of identify what projects are happening, who's working on them, how many people. It's often very difficult to do. You will find that aside from prior budgets, it's just people and capital
And allocation.
and so it makes it very difficult to identify where we need to cut. And I think one thing that has been talked about quite a bit is the fact that, it is the council's responsibility to establish the budget, and it is the city manager's responsibility to implement said budget. So when there are needs for there to be adjustments in terms of a budget, those are things that need to come before the council, before they're enacted, in order for the council to vote and approve those actions to be taken. So I think that when we are talking about the 2024 budget, it will be critical that we get the line items and the presentations that we need in order to make the necessary adjustments or pivots that we may need to make in order to ensure that we're right-sizing our budget. Again, I can't stress enough, what I'm seeing is we budget high, council knocks it down a little bit, and then our actuals come down lower. So making sure that we're able to make sure that the work aligns with what we can feasibly and what our staff can feasibly do, I think is important. And so are there any other, I see lots of lights. Councilmember DeBala.
I just wanted to finish my thoughts. So what I can do, given the hour, is to go back to my notes and look at the list of proposed revenue sources that we were thinking about working on, and get some information that way. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Councilmember Gibson?
Yeah, I wanted to really support that. I'd like to learn more about other revenue sources. Our property tax rate has remained stable for the last few years, but the property taxes have gone up. And then when we talk about economic development, as I've understood it, as it applies here, just means higher property taxes. So looking at other sources of revenue is something I'd like to do sooner rather than later, and maybe with staff as, to explore that kind of thing. I guess that's, yeah, so I sooner rather than later to get on both those issues. And I would strongly support, whether you call it line items. In a previous council meeting, I talked about time on task, which is basically another way of saying how much people time are involved in various projects. And so I strongly support that. We can't make decisions about whole departments. We have to make decisions on some of those line items that involve personnel, which is the very biggest budget item we have, which is personnel costs. Thank you.
Councilmember Honzak?
I'm aware that I have not spoken this evening because I am trying to absorb a lot as a new council member, but my background is in policy, and what I see going on here is really frustrating. I see that Director Chung has done exactly what I would expect Director Chung to do with revenues and expenditures and the way that the accounts are currently set up. But what we are not getting as council is the kind of translation of the numbers and the account meaning to layman's terms to comprehend exactly where, in layman's terms, the emergency funds lie and the therefore. And that kind of explanation is the kind of explanation that it would be, in my experience, would come from the city manager. So I am not sure if this is a request, but I just want to lay it out there that it would be my hope that in the future, if we embrace this topic again, that we would begin or end at least the conversation with a substantial overview of the big picture of fiscal health. You know, why is there a hiring freeze? Not just what is the expenditure and the revenue, but answer that question very directly, explain to us the rationale that is being utilized to make those decisions, whether or not you came to council, and I'm not ready to get into that. My incumbents understand that a lot better than me, but what I do know is that I really, really need to come into this new position understanding the actual fiscal health and what is common practice, as the mayor has described, and that is my experience so far of what I'm observing of local government. There's a different practice a little bit in federal government expenditures where you have to burn all the money over time, although I'm hearing now something I didn't know, that if there is actually a legality to spending all the money and making expenditures match, our revenues, then that is the first thing that we should hear as a new council. It's a basic, essential fact that we new people at least need to know. So I guess I'm asking hereby that if we have another meeting on this topic, that our city manager, that we don't just hear 2 or 3 words, but that we hear that big picture given to us right from the get-go, and how these big decisions have been made over the last 5 years. And I know you did the whole big presentation that you shared with us about fiscal health, I think, was it last year? But right now, I think we're in a new situation. We're sort of post-pandemic. Our revenues are back up again. So anyway, that is what I would hope for in the future. Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Small.
I just have one last thing, and it
Quick,
goes.
Councilmember Small.
Did you? Am I recognized or no?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
You're fine.
All right. I just wanted to make sure that, 2 things. Number one, Randy, it's well heard when you're talking about the tax rate versus the actual constant yield rate, because they're not the same. And by law in Maryland, if you are holding your tax rate at the same number, even though you have a new constant yield rate, you have to have a hearing, you have to put it in the newspaper, you got to do all kinds of stuff that explains it, and it is a separate hearing from any established budget hearings that you have as the process for your town. So it is important for people to understand when we are talking about tax numbers that holding the tax rate at the same level is considered indelicate and clunky, but it is considered a tax increase by the state of Maryland and has to be treated very delicately in the way in which you discuss it even. And as such, I'm not sure that we're even doing that either.
All right. Okay, so I see no more lights. And we're before 11 o'clock, which is great, given this topic. All right. Thank you all for tonight, and this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.